From the iron-willed Qin Shi Huang, who burned books and buried scholars alive, to the ruthless Mao Zedong, whose great leap forward starved millions, this is a calm yet chilling journey that we're about to embark on, lasting over 3 relaxing hours. We'll begin with why China's first emperor believed killing thinkers would unite his realm, and move deeper into how one chairman's grand farm plan became the deadliest famine ever recorded. So put your phone or television remote to the side, dim the lights, and please make sure to like the video, subscribe, and let me know where you are listening from in the comments. Now, let's begin. Qin Shi Huang, the Iron Emperor. In the mists of ancient China, when 7 warring kingdoms carved up the land like a chessboard of blood and ambition, one young prince would emerge to bind them all in chains of iron. His name was Zheng, King of Qin, though history would remember him by a grander, more terrible title, Qin Shi Huang, the first emperor of China. Born into a world where might made right and mercy was a luxury few could afford, this child would grow to become perhaps the most ruthlessly efficient unifier in human history. His story begins not with conquest, but with survival. The boy who would become China's Iron Emperor learned brutality early. As a young hostage in the court of Zhao, little Zheng witnessed the casual cruelty that defined the warring states period. Children were bargaining chips, alliances were written in disappearing ink, and trust was a currency that bought only betrayal. When he finally returned to Qin at age 9, the kingdom his father left him was already a war machine, its people hardened by generations of conflict, its army disciplined by the harsh philosophy of legalism. Where Confucians spoke of virtue and Taoists dreamed of harmony, the legalists offered something far more practical, absolute order through absolute power. By the time Zheng came of age, Qin had become something unique among the warring states. While other kingdoms clung to feudal traditions and aristocratic privileges, Qin had embraced a radical new way of thinking. Every citizen was a cog in the state machine. Every action was measured against its benefit to the realm. Individual desires, personal relationships, even family bonsall were subordinate to the greater good as defined by the state. It was a philosophy that would serve Zheng well in his quest to devour his neighbors. The conquest began in earnest when Zheng reached his majority. One by one, the rival kingdoms fell before Qin's disciplined legions. Han crumbled first, its ancient bloodlines swept away like autumn leaves. Zhao followed, the very kingdom that had once held young Zheng hostage, now paying the ultimate price for that childhood humiliation. Wei, Chu, Yan, and finally Qi's surrender brought more prisoners to work, Qin's vast construction projects, more territory to organize under Qin's rigid administrative system, more wealth to fuel the next campaign. But conquest was only the beginning. True power, Zheng understood, lay not in defeating enemies but in reshaping the very minds of one's subjects. In 213 BCE, he issued what historians would call the most devastating cultural order in Chinese history, the burning of the books. Confucian classics, historical records, poetry, philosophy, anything that preserved the memory of the old ways was consigned to the flames. The only books permitted were those dealing with practical matters, agriculture, medicine, divination. The past, with all its competing ideologies and alternative visions of government, would be erased. China would have only one history, the history that began with Qin Shi Huang. Even more chilling was the fate reserved for those who dared protest this cultural vandalism. When 460 Confucian scholars gathered to criticize the book burning, the emperor's response was swift and brutal. They were buried alive, their final screams muffled by the earth they had presumed to teach. It was a lesson written in blood. In the new China, there was room for only one voice, and it belonged to the emperor. The most visible symbol of Qin Shi Huang's authority, however, was not the burning libraries or the mass graves of scholars, but the Great Wall itself. Earlier kingdoms had built defensive walls along their borders, but these were modest affairs compared to the emperor's vision. He would bind his new empire together with stone and mortar, creating a barrier that would protect China from northern barbarians for all time. The human cost was staggering. Millions of worker soldiers, peasants, prisoners of war, labored in conditions that made survival a daily miracle. Contemporary accounts speak of bodies used as filler between stones, of workers who simply disappeared into the wall they were building. Every mile of that ancient barrier was purchased with human suffering on an almost incomprehensible scale. Yet perhaps nothing reveals the emperor's character more clearly than his obsession with immortality. Having conquered the known world, having unified China under his iron will, Qin Shi Huang turned his attention to the one enemy he could not defeat, death itself. He dispatched expeditions to find the legendary islands of the immortals, sent alchemists searching for elixirs of eternal life, consumed mercury-laced pills that probably hastened his demise. Meanwhile, thousands of artisans labored in secret on his tomb, creating an underground army of terracotta warriors to serve him in death, as his mortal legions had served him in life. The irony was exquisite. The man who had erased China's past spent his final years desperately trying to extend his future. The emperor who had buried scholars alive now surrounded himself with charlatans promising impossible cures. When death finally claimed him in 210 BCE, during an inspection tour of his eastern provinces, his inner circle kept the news secret for months, transporting his decomposing corpse in a cart loaded with rotting fish to mask the smell. Qin Shi Huang's empire died with him, torn apart by rebellion and civil war within 15 years of his death, but his legacy proved more durable than his dynasty. He had shown that China could be unified, that its vast distances and diverse peoples could be bound together under a single authority. Every subsequent emperor would look back to him as both model and cautionary tale, man who proved that absolute power was possible and who demonstrated the terrible price that such power demanded. In the end, perhaps the most chilling aspect of Qin Shi Huang's reign was not its cruelty but its efficiency. He created the template for authoritarian rule that would echo through Chinese history for millennia to come: the centralized bureaucracy, the standardized culture, the surveillance state, the cult of personality surrounding the supreme leader. He proved that human societies could be reshaped entirely through the systematic application of force, that traditions stretching back centuries could be erased in a generation, that individual will could be subordinated completely to state power. The Iron Emperor had forged his people into a nation, but the hammer blows that shaped China left scars that would never fully heal. Caligula, Rome's Mad Caesar. In the marble halls of imperial Rome, where power flowed like wine and madness lurked behind purple togas, no ruler embodied the corruption of absolute authority quite like Gaius, Julius Caesar Augustus Germanicus, though history remembers him by a childhood nickname that would become synonymous with tyrannical excess: Caligula, Little Boots. His reign lasted less than 4 years, yet in that brief span, he managed to transform the mightiest empire on earth into his personal playground of sadism, bankrupting the treasury while drowning Rome in blood and terror. It was a performance so spectacular in its depravity that it would forever after serve as a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked power. The boy who would become Rome's mad emperor began life as something of a mascot. Born into the imperial family during the reign of Augustus, young Gaius accompanied his father Germanicus on military campaigns along the Rhine frontier. The legions adored the child, crafting miniature military boots for his tiny feet and dubbing him Caligula Little Boots. He seemed destined for greatness, the son of Rome's most beloved general, heir to a legacy of honor and service. But fate, it seemed, had darker plans in store. When Germanicus died suddenly in 19 CE, possibly poisoned on the orders of the paranoid Emperor Tiberius, young Caligula's world collapsed into suspicion and fear. His mother Agrippina and his brothers fell victim to Tiberius's purges, victims of palace intrigue and the emperor's growing paranoia. Caligula alone survived, perhaps because his youth made him seem harmless, perhaps because Tiberius enjoyed having a potential heir under his complete control. The boy spent his formative years walking on eggshells, watching relatives disappear in the night, learning that survival in the imperial court required a careful balance of submission and cunning. When Tiberius finally died in 37 CE, possibly smothered by Caligula himself, according to some accounts, the young prince ascended to the throne amid unprecedented celebration. Romans had grown weary of the old emperor's increasingly erratic rule and crushing taxation. Here, they believed, was a return to the golden age of Augustus, a young emperor who would restore Rome's glory and generosity. For a few shining months, it seemed their hopes would be fulfilled. Caligula freed political prisoners, recalled exiles, distributed bonuses to the Praetorian Guard, and staged magnificent games that delighted the masses. But then something changed. Whether it was a severe illness that struck him 8 months into his reign, the sudden intoxication of unlimited power, or simply the inevitable flowering of madness that had been planted by years of trauma and fear, Caligula underwent a transformation that chilled the blood of all who witnessed it. The generous young emperor disappeared, replaced by something monstrous, unpredictable, and terrifyingly creative in its cruelty. The first signs were subtle: odd proclamations, bizarre appointments, a growing obsession with divine honors. But as Caligula's confidence grew, so did his excesses. He began appearing in public, dressed as various gods: Jupiter, Neptune, Apollo, demanding that citizens worship him as a living deity. He ordered his statue placed in temples throughout the empire, including the sacred temple in Jerusalem, nearly triggering a revolt that would have drowned Judea in blood decades before the Great Rebellion that actually occurred. His treatment of the Senate revealed both his contempt for republican traditions and his genius for psychological torture. He would summon elderly senators to run alongside his chariot for miles, watching with amusement as they collapsed from exhaustion. He forced them to participate in degrading theatrical performances, made them kiss his feet in public, and on at least one occasion declared war on Neptune and ordered his soldiers to collect seashells as spoils of war, while the bewildered senators watched from the shore. But it was in his private cruelties that Caligula's true nature emerged most clearly. He delighted in forcing parents to witness the execution of their children, often insisting they attend banquets immediately afterward and maintain a cheerful demeanor throughout the meal. He would interrupt his own dinner parties to order random executions, returning to his guests with blood still wet on his hands and a smile on his lips. His victims were chosen by Wimmer merchant who had offended him years earlier, a gladiator who had fought too well, a senator whose wife he desired. The story of his horse Incitatus became the stuff of legend, though historians debate whether it actually happened or merely represents the kind of thing Caligula was capable of doing. According to Suetonius, the emperor loved his horse so much that he housed it in a marble stable, fed it from an ivory manger, and even considered making it a consul Rome's highest elected office. Whether literally true or not, the tale perfectly captured the emperor's contempt for Roman institutions and his delight in making a mockery of everything his subjects held sacred. Money flowed through Caligula's hands like water through a broken dam. Within a year of taking power, he had squandered the vast treasury surplus left by the frugal Tiberius, spending fortunes on games, spectacles, and building projects that served no purpose beyond satisfying his megalomania. He constructed a temporary bridge across the Bay of Naples, nearly 3 miles long, simply so he could ride across it wearing the breastplate of Alexander the Great. When funds ran low, he resorted to increasingly desperate measures: forced inheritances, trumped, upcharges of treason, auctions where citizens were required to bid on worthless items at ruinous prices. The emperor's sexual appetites were as boundless as his cruelty. He seduced the wives of dinner guests at his own table, sometimes returning to describe their performance in graphic detail. He had incestuous relationships with all 3 of his sisters, treating them as both lovers and political tools. When his favorite sister Drusilla died, he declared her a goddess and made it a capital offense to laugh, bathe, or dine with one's family while the empire was in mourning. As Caligula's behavior grew more erratic and dangerous, whispers of conspiracy began to echo through the corridors of power. The Praetorian Guard, supposedly his most loyal supporters, found themselves caught between their oath of loyalty and their growing horror at the emperor's actions. Senators who had once competed for his favor now lived in daily terror of arbitrary execution. Even the common people, initially charmed by his lavish entertainments, began to grumble as taxes soared and food shortages became common. The end, when it came, was swift and brutal. On January 24, 41 CE, as Caligula was leaving the theatre after watching a performance, a conspiracy of Praetorian officers struck. Cassius Chaerea, whom Caligula had repeatedly humiliated with jokes about his supposed effeminacy, delivered the first blow. The emperor, who had styled himself a god, died in a tunnel beneath the Palatine Hill, his blood soaking into the same stones where his predecessors had walked in dignity. The assassins also murdered Caligula's wife and infant daughter, ensuring that no heir could rally loyalists to continue his line. It was a thorough end to a thoroughly mad reign, yet the damage had been done. Caligula had shown how quickly the Principate could descend into naked tyranny, how easily the careful constitutional balance established by Augustus could be shattered by a single, unhinged individual. In the end, Caligula's greatest achievement may have been demonstrating the absolute necessity of checks on imperial power, a lesson that future emperors would either learn or ignore at their peril. His reign became a byword for the dangers of absolute power corrupting absolutely, a 4-year nightmare that haunted Roman political thought for generations to come. The mad emperor had ruled for less than 4 years, but he had managed to transform the very nature of imperial authority, proving that the line between divine ruler and deranged tyrant was thinner than anyone had dared imagine. Nero, the firebringer. When the Great Fire of Rome began on a sweltering July night in 64 CE, consuming the city's wooden tenements and narrow streets in an inferno that would burn for 6 days and 7 nights, one man's name would forever be linked to the catastrophe. Nero Claudius Caesar Augustus Germanicus, 5th Emperor of Rome, stands in history as the archetypal tyrant artist, a ruler whose reign combined spectacular cruelty with grandiose aesthetic ambitions. Whether he actually played his lyre, while Rome Benito's legend claims matters less than what that image represents, a leader so divorced from his people's suffering that he could find beauty in their destruction. Nero's path to power began in the shadows of palace intrigue, where his mother Agrippina the Younger proved herself a master of the deadly game of imperial succession. Born Lucius Domitius Ahenobarbus, the future emperor was just 3 years old when his father died, leaving him in the care of a mother whose ambition burned as fiercely as any flame that would later consume Rome. Agrippina understood that in the Julio-Claudian dynasty, proximity to power meant survival, while distance meant death. She maneuvered her way into marriage with Emperor Claudius, convincing him to adopt her son and name him heir over his own biological son, Britannicus. The young prince who would become Nero received the finest education Roman wealth could provide. The philosopher Seneca served as his tutor, attempting to instill stoic virtue and rational governance in a boy who seemed more interested in music, poetry, and theatrical performance than in the brutal realities of ruling an empire. From an early age, Nero displayed an artist's temperament trapped within an emperor's obligations, a contradiction that would define his reign and ultimately contribute to his downfall. When Claudius died in 54 CE, possibly poisoned by Agrippina herself, according to persistent rumor, 16-year-old Nero ascended to the throne amid the usual promises of clemency and good governance. Initially, his reign seemed to justify the optimism. Guided by Seneca and the Praetorian prefect Burrus, the young emperor appeared reasonable, even generous. He reduced taxes, increased the powers of the Senate, and provided lavish entertainments for the people. Romans dared to hope that they had found a philosopher king, a ruler who would combine wisdom with compassion. But beneath the surface, darker currents were stirring. Nero's relationship with his domineering mother had grown increasingly strained as he chafed under her attempts to control his reign. Agrippina had placed him on the throne, but she seemed to expect gratitude in the form of perpetual submission. The young emperor, however, had discovered the intoxicating reality of absolute power and was reluctant to share it, even with the woman who had made it possible. The first crack in Nero's carefully maintained facade came with his treatment of Britannicus, his adoptive brother and potential rival. At a dinner party in 55 CE, the 14-year-old prince suddenly collapsed and died after drinking wine that had allegedly been poisoned. Whether Nero ordered the murder or merely allowed it to happen remains unclear, but the message was unmistakable. The new emperor would not tolerate threats to his authority, even from family members. As Nero's confidence grew, so did his artistic ambitions and his willingness to shock traditional Roman sensibilities. He began performing publicly as a singer and charioteer, scandalizing the aristocracy who considered such activities beneath imperial dignity. But for Nero, these performances were not mere entertainment. They were expressions of his deepest self, validations of his artistic genius that he believed transcended the mundane concerns of governance. His personal life became increasingly turbulent and violent. He divorced his first wife, Claudia Octavia, and had her murdered to clear the way for marriage to Poppaea Sabina, a beautiful but manipulative woman who seemed to encourage his worst impulses. When Poppaea died during pregnancy, possibly kicked to death by Nero in a fit of rage, the emperor's behavior became even more erratic. He found a slave boy named Sporus, who resembled his dead wife, had him castrated, and married him in a public ceremony, forcing the Senate to treat the boy as an empress. But it was Nero's relationship with his mother that would produce the most shocking crime of his reign. Agrippina's continued attempts to influence policy and her threats to support rival claimants finally exhausted her son's patience. In 59 CE, Nero arranged what may have been the most elaborate matricide in history. First, he tried to kill her with a collapsing ceiling, then with a sabotaged boat designed to sink in the Bay of Naples. When both attempts failed and Agrippina swam to shore, Nero finally sent soldiers to finish the job. According to Tacitus, her last words were a command to stab her in the womb that had borne such a monster. The Great Fire of 64 CE marked the turning point of Nero's reign, though whether by accident or design remains one of history's great mysteries. The blaze began in shops near the Circus Maximus and spread rapidly through Rome's densely packed neighborhoods. By the time it was extinguished, 10 of the city's 14 districts lay in ruins, hundreds of thousands were homeless, and countless lives had been lost. Rumors immediately began circulating that Nero had started the fire to clear land for his architectural projects, though he was actually in Antium, 35 miles away, when the flames began. What cannot be disputed is how Nero responded to the crisis. While he did open his own properties to house refugees and organized relief efforts, he also used the disaster as an opportunity to build his Domus Aureus Golden House, a vast palace complex that covered over 300 acres of central Rome. The palace was a monument to imperial excess, featuring a colossal statue of Nero himself, artificial lakes, vineyards, and a dining room with a rotating ceiling that scattered flowers and perfume on guests below. As reconstruction costs mounted and taxes soared, Nero needed scapegoats for the fire and the empire's mounting problems. He found them in Rome's small but growing Christian community. The emperor ordered mass arrests of Christians, subjecting them to spectacularly cruel executions, designed to entertain the masses while deflecting blame from his own administration. Some were sewn into animal skins and torn apart by dogs. Others were crucified or burned alive as human torches to illuminate Nero's gardens during his evening parties. The persecution of Christians would later be remembered as one of Nero's most heinous crimes, but at the time, it seemed to work. The Roman people, initially sympathetic to the fire's victims, gradually began to accept the narrative that foreign cultists had destroyed their city. But Nero's problems were only beginning. His artistic pretensions grew ever more grandiose and expensive. He planned a tour of Greece to compete in musical and athletic competitions, where local officials would naturally ensure his victory in every event. Meanwhile, the empire's finances crumbled under the weight of reconstruction costs, lavish entertainments, and Nero's building projects. Provincial governors began withholding tribute, the army grew restless over delayed pay, and whispers of revolt echoed through the provinces. The end began in 68 CE, with Gaius Julius Vindex's rebellion in Gaul, which inspired Galba, the governor of Hispania Tarraconensis, to declare himself emperor. When the Praetorian Guard defected and the Senate declared Nero a public enemy, the emperor's world collapsed with stunning speed. Abandoned by all but a few loyal freedmen, he fled Rome in disguise, allegedly lamenting, "What an artist dies in me." On June 9, 68 CE, as pursuing soldiers closed in on his hiding place, Nero took his own life, with the help of his secretary Epaphroditus. His last words, according to Suetonius, were a fitting epitaph for a reign that had confused artistic vision with political reality. Too late, this is fidelity. Nero's death plunged the Roman Empire into its first major succession crisis since Augustus, triggering the Year of the Four Emperors and nearly bringing down the imperial system entirely. His reign had lasted 14 years, but the damage he inflicted on Roman institutions and traditions would reverberate for generations. In the end, Nero represented a uniquely dangerous type of tyrantone who genuinely believed in his own genius and saw opposition as a failure to appreciate his gifts. He was neither a coldly calculating monster like Caligula, nor a brutally efficient conqueror like Huang, but rather an artist emperor whose aesthetic ambitions knew no moral boundaries. His legacy would serve as a warning about the dangers of combining unlimited power with unlimited ego, a cautionary tale about what happens when the line between performance and governance disappears entirely. The firebringer had burned himself out, but the flames he kindled would continue to illuminate the darkest possibilities of imperial rule. Genghis Khan, the Scourge of the Steppes. In the vast emptiness of the Mongolian steppes, where the horizon stretches endlessly in every direction and the wind carries whispers of ancient conquests, one name still echoes with the force of thundering hooves. Temujin, better known to history as Genghis Khan, the great Khan who would forge the largest contiguous land empire the world has ever known. His story begins not with glory and conquest, but with abandonment, betrayal, and a childhood so harsh that it forged a soul of iron and a will that would never bend. From these brutal origins would emerge a military genius whose very name became synonymous with terror across 2 continents. The boy who would one day rule from Eastern Europe to the Pacific Ocean began life as little more than a castaway on the windswept grasslands of Mongolia. Born around 1162 CE into the Borjigin clan, Temujin's early years were marked by the constant struggle for survival that defined nomadic life. When his father, Yasuge, was poisoned by rival Tatars, 9-year-old Temujin found himself thrust into a world where might truly made right, and mercy was a luxury that could cost one's life. The Taichud tribe, once allied with his father, abandoned Temujin's family to die on the steppes, taking their horses and leaving them to face the coming winter on foot. His mother, Hoilun, kept the family alive through sheer force of will, foraging for roots and berries, catching fish with her bare hands, teaching her children that survival required both cunning and ruthlessness. It was a lesson that Temujin would never forget, and one that would later color every decision he made as supreme ruler of the Mongol Empire. The steppes were a harsh teacher, but they produced warriors of incomparable skill and endurance. Young Temujin learned to ride before he could properly walk, to shoot arrows from horseback with deadly accuracy, to read the weather in the color of the sky and the behavior of animals. More importantly, he learned that in a world without laws or permanent settlements, loyalty was the only currency that mattered and that betrayal was the one crime that could never be forgiven. As he grew to manhood, Temujin began the slow, bloody process of forging alliances among the fractured Mongol tribes. His charisma was undeniable, his military skill increasingly obvious, but what set him apart from other tribal leaders was his revolutionary approach to warfare and governance. Where other Khans relied on blood relationships and traditional hierarchies, Temujin promoted based on merit alone. He broke down the ancient tribal divisions that had kept the Mongols weak and scattered, organizing his forces into decimal unit stens, hundreds, thousands, and 10,000s called tumens that owed allegiance to him personally rather than to any clan or bloodline. The key to Mongol military supremacy lay not just in their horsemanship, though that was formidable enough. Each warrior possessed multiple horses, allowing the army to move at speeds that seemed impossible to their enemies. They lived on mare's milk and dried meat, requiring no supply trains or lengthy preparations for campaign. Most crucially, they had perfected the art of psychological warfare, using terror as both weapon and shield. When Temujin finally united the Mongol tribes in 1206 CE and took the title Genghis Khan, meaning universal ruler, he immediately turned his attention to the settled civilizations that surrounded his homeland. The Western Shah, the Jin dynasty, the Khwarezmid Empire would learn in turn what it meant to face the fury of the united Mongol nation. The siege of Zhongdu, capital of the Jin dynasty, revealed both Genghis Khan's strategic brilliance and his absolute ruthlessness. Unable to take the heavily fortified city by storm, he systematically devastated the surrounding countryside, driving hundreds of thousands of refugees into the city until overcrowding and starvation did what his armies could not. When the city finally surrendered, the Mongols spent 30 days systematically looting and burning it, leaving barely a stone standing upon another. But it was the destruction of the Khwarezmid Empire that truly established Genghis Khan's reputation as history's most terrifying conqueror. The campaign began almost by accident. Mongol merchants were murdered in the city of Otrar, and the Khwarezmian Shah foolishly compounded the insult by killing Genghis Khan's envoys when they came to demand justice. The Great Khan's response was swift and absolute. He would erase the Khwarezmid Empire from the face of the earth. The siege of Nishapur became the stuff of nightmares. When the city fell after a heroic defense, Genghis Khan ordered every living thing within its walls to be killed: men, women, children, even cats and dogs. The heads of the dead were arranged in separate pyramids according to gender, creating a monument to terror that could be seen for miles. Even the irrigation systems were destroyed, turning fertile farmland into desert and ensuring that the city could never be rebuilt. Yet for all his brutality in war, Genghis Khan proved to be a surprisingly pragmatic ruler. His legal code, the Yasa, established principles that were radical for their time: religious tolerance, diplomatic immunity, promotion based on merit rather than birth, and protection for merchants and artisans. The Mongol Empire became a conduit for trade and cultural exchange on an unprecedented scale, connecting East and West in ways that would reshape the medieval world. The Great Khan understood that fear could open cities, but only justice could hold an empire together. He exempted religious leaders from taxation, protected the Silk Road trade routes that were the arteries of medieval commerce, and established a postal system that allowed communication across vast distances. Scholars, engineers, and artists were spared during conquests and relocated to where their skills were most needed, creating a brain trust that helped transform the Mongol Empire from a confederation of nomadic tribes into the most sophisticated administrative system of its age. But perhaps the most chilling aspect of Genghis Khan's genius was his understanding of human nature. He knew that conquered peoples would submit more readily to a ruler who seemed invincible than to one who showed mercy to rebels. Every act of terrible vengeance served a purpose: to convince the next city that resistance was futile, to spread the reputation that would make future conquests easier and less costly in Mongol blood. The numbers alone tell the story of his impact on human history. Conservative estimates suggest that the Mongol conquests resulted in the deaths of 30 million people, roughly 11% of the world's population at the time. Entire civilizations were swept away, leaving archaeological gaps that persist to this day. The Middle East, in particular, never fully recovered from the devastation wreaked by Mongol armies, with some regions remaining depopulated for centuries. When Genghis Khan died in 1227 CE, possibly from injuries sustained in a fall from his horse, he had created an empire that stretched from the Caspian Sea to the Sea of Japan. His sons and grandsons would extend Mongol rule even further, conquering Russia, invading Europe, and establishing dynasties that would rule China and Persia for centuries. The genetic legacy of the Mongol conquests persists to this day. Scientists estimate that roughly 16 million men, or about 0.5% of the global male population, carry Y chromosome markers, indicating descent from Genghis Khan. But beyond the statistics of conquest and slaughter, Genghis Khan's true legacy lies in the transformation of warfare itself. He proved that mobility, discipline, and psychological terror could overcome any defensive advantage, that traditional military hierarchies and tactics were no match for innovative thinking and absolute unity of command. Every successful military leader who followed would study his campaigns, borrowing his strategies while hoping to avoid his fate. In the end, the Great Khan represented both the pinnacle and the paradox of nomadic civilization, a man who destroyed cities to preserve a way of life based on endless movement, who created the largest empire in history while remaining, at heart, a child of the steppes. His name became a byword for destruction across the civilized world, yet his empire facilitated trade, cultural exchange, and technological innovation on a scale never before achieved. The Scourge of the steppes had remade the world in his image, leaving behind an empire that would outlast him by centuries and a reputation that would endure for millennia. In conquering the world, he had made himself immortal not through the elixirs and monuments sought by other tyrants, but through the simple expedient of making his name synonymous with terror itself. Timur, Tamerlane, the Pyramids of Skulls. In the twilight of the 14th century, when the Islamic world was fracturing into competing dynasties and the echoes of Mongol conquest had faded to whispers, a new conqueror arose from the ashes of Central Asia to remind humanity that the age of universal terror was far from over. Timur ibn Taragay Barlas, known to history as Tamerlaneth, Timur the Lame, would prove that the legacy of Genghis Khan was not buried with the Great Khan, but merely dormant, waiting for the right man to awaken it in all its terrible glory. Born around 1336 in what is now Uzbekistan, Timur emerged from the chaotic remnants of the Mongol Empire's Chagatai Khanate, where Turkish and Mongol tribes vied for supremacy over the ruins of ancient civilizations. Unlike Genghis Khan, who rose from genuine poverty, Timur began life as a minor noble, the son of a tribal chief who commanded respect but little territory. His early years were spent in the small-scale warfare that plagued Central Asia, learning the arts of cavalry combat and tribal politics that would serve him well in his later campaigns of world conquest. The defining moment of Timur's youth came not in battle but in a riding accidenta, perhaps an enemy arrow that left him permanently lame in his right leg and weakened his right arm. In a culture that prized physical perfection and martial prowess above all else, this disability might have ended his career before it began. Instead, it seemed to fuel an inner fire that would eventually consume much of the known world. Timur compensated for his physical limitations with an iron will and a strategic mind that operated on a scale few of his contemporaries could comprehend. By his 30s, Timur had consolidated control over Transoxiana, the fertile region between the Amu Darya and Sir Darya rivers that had been fought over by empires since the dawn of recorded history. But unlike other regional strongmen who were content to rule their own backyard, Timur nursed grander ambitions. He claimed descent from Genghis Khan, a largely fictional genealogy that nonetheless provided useful legitimacy, and began styling himself as the rightful heir to Mongol imperial tradition. His military machine combined the mobility and psychological warfare of his Mongol predecessors with innovations suited to the changed circumstances of the 14th century. Timur's armies moved with devastating speed, but they also possessed sophisticated siege equipment and engineering corps capable of reducing the most formidable fortifications. More importantly, they operated according to a systematic doctrine of terror that made Mongol brutality seem almost restrained by comparison. The conquest of Persia in the 1380s established the pattern that would characterize all of Timur's campaigns. Cities that surrendered immediately might be spared the worst excesses, though their wealth would still be seized and their populations deported to serve in Timur's capital of Samarkand. But those that dared to resist faced annihilation so complete and horrific that the very memory of their destruction would serve as a warning to future generations. Isfahan learned this lesson at a cost that still defies comprehension. When the city rebelled against Mongol rule after initially surrendering, Timur's response was methodical and absolute. His soldiers were ordered to bring him the severed heads of the rebels, with each man required to produce a quota or face execution himself. The result was a massacre that claimed an estimated 70 lives, their heads arranged in towering pyramids around the city that could be seen from miles away monuments to the price of defying Tamerlane. These pyramids of skulls became Timur's signature, his calling card left at the gates of conquered cities like a grotesque business card. At Baghdad, 90 heads formed similar monuments. At Delhi, the number may have reached 100. Each pyramid was carefully constructed according to Timur's specifications, with the heads cemented in place using a mortar made from lime, clay, and human blood. They were designed to last, to serve as permanent reminders of what happened to those who challenged the heir of Genghis Khan. The 1398 invasion of India showcased both Timur's strategic brilliance and his capacity for casual cruelty on an almost incomprehensible scale. The stated purpose was religious, to wage jihad against the Hindu population and their Muslim rulers who had grown too tolerant of infidel customs. But the real motivation was simpler Delhi's legendary wealth and the opportunity to surpass even Genghis Khan's conquests in scope and terror. The march on Delhi became a procession of horrors. As Timur's army advanced through northern India, they systematically depopulated entire regions, carrying off hundreds of thousands of slaves while putting to death anyone too old, young, or weak to be useful. Hindu temples were razed to their foundations, their stones used to build victory monuments decorated with the severed heads of priests and worshippers. Even Muslim cities that offered no resistance were looted and burned, their populations scattered to the winds. When Sultan Nasir-ud-Din Mahmud finally gathered the courage to face Timur in battle outside Delhi, the outcome was never really in doubt. The Delhi Sultanate's army, despite numbering in the hundreds of thousands, was no match for Timur's disciplined cavalry and superior tactics. More devastating than the military defeat, however, was what followed. For 5 days, Timur's soldiers were given free rein to loot, rape, and murder throughout Delhi. Contemporary accounts describe streets literally flowing with blood, entire neighborhoods reduced to ash, and such a thorough slaughter that it took the city decades to recover even a fraction of its former population. Yet perhaps the most chilling aspect of Timur's character was the contrast between his public brutality and his private sophistication. In Samarkand, the capital he was simultaneously building with slave labor and looted wealth, he patronized artists, scholars, and architects on a scale that rivaled the greatest rulers of his age. The city became a jewel of Islamic civilization, its madrasas and mosques attracting the finest minds from across the Muslim world. Timur himself was well educated, fluent in several languages, and genuinely interested in theology, philosophy, and the arts. This wasn't hypocrisy so much as a calculated understanding of how to build and maintain an empire. Terror secured submission, but culture provided legitimacy. The scholars and artists who gathered in Samarkand served as living propaganda, proof that Timur was not merely a destroyer but a creator of civilization. Their works celebrated his victories, while subtly justifying his methods, crafting a narrative that portrayed mass murder as necessary for the greater good of Islamic unity and purity. The campaign against the Ottoman Empire in 1402 demonstrated that Timur's ambitions recognized no boundaries. Sultan Bayezid I, known as the Thunderbolt for his rapid conquests, had established the Ottomans as the dominant power in Anatolia and the Balkans. For two great Muslim empires to coexist was intolerable to Timur, who saw himself as the rightful heir to universal Islamic leadership. The Battle of Ankara became one of the most decisive encounters in medieval history, with consequences that would echo for centuries. Timur's victory was complete. Bayezid was captured, his army destroyed, and Ottoman expansion into Europe halted for a generation. The captured sultan was allegedly kept in a cage and paraded through Timur's territories like an exotic animal, though this detail may be the invention of later chroniclers eager to emphasize the conqueror's cruelty. More significant was Timur's decision not to consolidate his victory. Rather than establishing permanent control over Anatolia, he withdrew to Central Asia, content with having demonstrated his supremacy. This pattern-devastating conquest, followed by strategic withdrawal, characterized much of his career. Timur was less interested in governing a world empire than in proving that he could conquer one. His treatment of prisoners and civilians revealed a mind that had systematized cruelty to an almost industrial degree. Captured artisans and craftsmen were invariably spared and deported to Samarkand, where they were forced to beautify Timur's capital with their skills. Religious scholars might be engaged in theological debates even as their cities burned around them, but ordinary soldiers and civilians faced fates that medieval chroniclers struggled to describe adequately. The sheer scale of destruction wrought by Timur's campaigns defies easy comprehension. Conservative estimates suggest that his conquests resulted in the deaths of 17 million people, or only 5% of the world's population at the time. Entire regions were so thoroughly depopulated that they remained uninhabited for generations. The irrigation systems of Central Asia and Persia, built up over millennia, were systematically destroyed, transforming fertile farmland into desert that has never fully recovered. When Timur died in 1402, 405. En route to what would have been his greatest campaign, the conquest of Ming Chinai's empire immediately began to fragment. Unlike Genghis Khan, who had established institutions capable of outlasting his death, Timur had built a state that was entirely dependent on his personal charisma and military genius. His sons and grandsons proved capable rulers in their own right, particularly in Central Asia and India, but none possessed the vision or ruthlessness necessary to hold together the vast territories their father had conquered. The Timurid successor states would produce some of the greatest cultural achievements in Islamic history: the astronomical observations of Ulugh Beg in Samarkand, the architectural marvels of Herat, and eventually the Mughal Empire in India, founded by Timur's descendant Babur. But these later accomplishments could not erase the memory of the devastation that had made them possible. Timur's legacy is perhaps more complex than that of any other conqueror in human history. On one hand, he was responsible for destruction on a scale that dwarfed even Genghis Khan's worst excesses. On the other, the cultural renaissance that flourished in his wake produced artistic and intellectual achievements that enriched human civilization. He was simultaneously the ultimate barbarian and the ultimate patron of high culture, a contradiction that speaks to the complex relationship between power, violence, and civilization itself. In the end, Tamerlane proved that the age of world conquerors was not over, that the right combination of military genius, absolute ruthlessness, and strategic vision could still reshape the known world through the systematic application of terror. His pyramids of skulls stood as monuments not just to his own power, but to humanity's enduring capacity for both creation and destruction, often at the hands of the same individual. The lame conqueror had made himself the equal of Genghis Khan in terror, while surpassing him in the sophistication of his court and the beauty of his capital. In doing so, he had demonstrated that civilization and barbarism were not opposites but dance partners, locked in an embrace that was both creative and deadly. Vlad III, the Impaler Prince. In the shadow of the Carpathian Mountains, where mist clings to ancient forests and wolves still howl in the darkness, one name evokes terror even 5 centuries after his death. Vlad III, Dracula, Prince of Wallachia, earned his grim epithet not through battlefield prowess or imperial conquest, but through an innovation in cruelty so distinctive that it became his defining characteristic: the systematic use of impalement as both weapon of war and instrument of state policy. The historical Vlad bears little resemblance to the vampire of Gothic fiction, yet in some ways the real man was far more terrifying than any creature of supernatural imagination. Born around 1431 into a world where survival depended on navigating the treacherous currents of Eastern European politics, young Vlad learned early that weakness invited annihilation. His father, Vlad II Dracul, ruled Wallachia as a vassal of the Hungarian kingdom while simultaneously paying tribute to the expanding Ottoman Empire, precarious position that required constant diplomatic maneuvering and occasional betrayal of former allies. The name Dracul meant dragon, referring to his membership in the Order of the Dragon, a chivalric society dedicated to defending Christendom against Ottoman expansion. His son would inherit both the name and the seemingly impossible task of preserving Wallachian independence against overwhelming odds. When Vlad was 11 years old, his father made a decision that would shape the future prince's entire worldview. To secure Ottoman support for his throne, Dracul sent both Vlad and his younger brother Radu as hostages to the court of Sultan Murad II. For the next 4 years, the boys lived in the opulent but dangerous world of the Ottoman court, where they received a classical Islamic education while serving as guarantees of their father's loyalty. The experience was transformative, but in radically different ways for each brother. Radu adapted to Ottoman culture, eventually converting to Islam and becoming a favored companion of the future Sultan Mehmed II. Vlad, however, remained stubbornly resistant to Ottoman influence, nursing a hatred for his captors that would only intensify with time. He observed Ottoman military tactics and administrative methods with the cold attention of a future enemy, filing away information that would later prove crucial in his struggles against the empire. The brutal realities of 15th-century Balkan politics intruded dramatically in 1447, when Vlad's father and elder brother were assassinated by Wallachian boyars allied with Hungary. Suddenly, the teenage hostage found himself the rightful heir to a throne, controlled by his family's murderers, in a country caught between two expanding empires that viewed Wallachia primarily as a strategic buffer zone. Vlad's first reign, beginning in 1448 with Ottoman support, lasted only 2 months before Hungarian-backed rivals drove him into exile. It was a harsh lesson in the realities of Wallachian politics. Survival required not just military skill but also the absolute elimination of all potential threats. When he finally regained power in 1456, Vlad had learned to see mercy as a fatal weakness and terror as the most efficient tool of statecraft. The methods that earned him the nickname Teeps, the Impaler, were not born of sadistic impulse but of calculated political necessity. Wallachia's position between the Ottoman and Hungarian empires made it a constant battleground, while internal divisions among the boyar families had kept the principality weak and unstable for generations. Vlad's solution was elegantly simple. He would eliminate opposition through means so horrific that future resistance would become unthinkable. Impalement, as practiced by Vlad, was not a quick death but a carefully orchestrated form of torture that could last for hours or even days. The technique involved inserting a sharpened wooden stake through the victim's rectum or vagina, pushing it slowly through the body until it emerged from the mouth or shoulder, then mounting the stake vertically so that the victim's own weight would cause the stake to gradually penetrate deeper. The process required considerable skill to avoid damaging vital organs too quickly, allowing the victim to remain conscious and suffer for maximum psychological impact on observers. The Easter Massacre of 1459 demonstrated both Vlad's strategic thinking and his capacity for theatrical cruelty. Inviting the boyar families to a feast ostensibly held to celebrate the resurrection of Christ, he instead had them seized and impaled in the courtyard of his palace. The older nobles died quickly on their stakes, but the younger ones were forced to march to the ruins of Poyanari Castle, where they labored to rebuild Vlad's mountain fortress before finally being impaled themselves. It was a message written in blood. Opposition to Vlad would result not just in death, but in death preceded by humiliation and agony. Foreign merchants and visiting diplomats found themselves subject to Vlad's peculiar sense of justice, which brooked no deviation from his personal moral code. Saxon merchants who cheated their customers might find themselves impaled alongside their goods, the stakes arranged to display both the crime and its punishment. Turkish envoys who refused to remove their turbans in his presence, claiming religious obligation, were accommodated by having the turbans nailed to their skulls. Every aspect of life in Wallachia was subject to Vlad's absolute authority, enforced through methods that made the gallows seem merciful by comparison. The forest of the impaled that Vlad created outside Targovishte in 1462 became the stuff of legend even in his own lifetime. When Sultan Mehmed III, conqueror of Constantinople, marched into Wallachia with an army of 60 men, he discovered a forest of stakes stretching for miles, bearing the decomposing bodies of 20 Turkish prisoners and Wallachian collaborators. The sight was so horrific that even the Sultan, hardened by years of warfare and conquest, reportedly turned back rather than continue through this monument to systematic cruelty. Yet Vlad's use of terror was not random but carefully calculated to achieve specific political and military objectives. The forest of stakes served multiple purposes. It demonstrated to the Ottoman army that their prince was capable of horrific revenge against those who betrayed him. It warned potential collaborators about the fate that awaited them, and it created a psychological barrier that was more effective than any physical fortification. Turkish morale, already shaken by months of guerrilla warfare, collapsed entirely when confronted with evidence of what capture by Vlad's forces would entail. The prince's domestic policies revealed the same combination of brutal efficiency and twisted justice that characterized his foreign relations. Thieves were impaled alongside their stolen goods. Adulterous women had their sexual organs cut off before being impaled. Lazy servants found themselves permanently attached to their work tools through strategically placed stakes. Yet Vlad also created a perverse kind of order. Crime virtually disappeared during his reign, and Wallachia achieved a stability it had not known for generations. His personal behavior became increasingly erratic as his reign progressed, suggesting that years of sanctioned violence had begun to affect his mental state. Contemporary accounts describe elaborate dinner parties held among groves of impaled victims, with Vlad dining calmly while the dying groaned around him. He allegedly had his own mistress impaled when she claimed to be pregnant by him, cutting open her body to verify whether she had been telling the truth. Such stories may be exaggerated by hostile chroniclers, but they reflect a reputation for casual cruelty that Vlad cultivated deliberately. The irony of Vlad's career was that his methods, while effective in the short term, ultimately ensured his downfall. His own boyars, terrified of becoming his next victims, conspired with Hungarian agents to remove him from power. Even his brother Radu, now serving as an Ottoman client ruler, had turned against him. In 1462, Vlad was captured by Hungarian forces and imprisoned for 12 years. His reign of terror ended not by foreign conquest but by domestic betrayal. When he finally regained his throne in 1476, Vlad found a changed world. The Ottoman Empire had consolidated its control over the Balkans, making Wallachian independence a practical impossibility. His final reign lasted only 2 months before he was killed in battle, perhaps assassinated by his own men, leaving behind a legacy that would far outlive his brief and bloody career. The historical Vlad III disappeared into legend almost immediately after his death. His story preserved and embellished by chroniclers who saw in him either a heroic defender of Christendom or a monster whose cruelty exceeded all bounds of human decency. The Romanian people, suffering under centuries of foreign occupation, gradually transformed him into a folk hero whose harsh methods were justified by the greater good of national independence. But it was Bram Stoker who gave Vlad his ultimate immortality, borrowing his name and homeland for a vampire count who would become one of literature's most enduring villains. The fictional Dracula bears little resemblance to the historical prince, yet in some ways Stoker's creation captures something essential about the real man, the idea that absolute power, exercised without moral restraint, transforms its wielder into something no longer quite human. Vlad III had ruled for barely 6 years in total, but his influence on the imagination was far more lasting than his political achievements. He proved that terror, systematically applied, could substitute for military strength or diplomatic skill, at least temporarily. His forest of stakes became a metaphor for the price of absolute authority, a reminder that those who rule through fear must ultimately face the consequences of their own methods. The Impaler prince had sought to preserve his homeland's independence through the application of unparalleled cruelty, but in the end, he succeeded only in preserving his own name in the annals of human horror. His stakes had pierced more than just human bodies, they had penetrated the collective memory of civilization itself, ensuring that Vlad III would be remembered long after more conventionally successful rulers had been forgotten. Ivan IV, the terrible Tsar. In the frozen expanse of 16th-century Muscovy, where winter winds carried whispers of ancient Mongol terror and the orthodox bells of countless churches marked time in a land where time itself seemed frozen, one ruler would earn a title that captures both awe and horror in a single word: Grozny, the Terrible. Ivan IV, the first man to claim the title of Tsar of all Russia, embodied the contradiction at the heart of Russian autocracy, a ruler who expanded his realm beyond all previous bounds, while simultaneously tearing it apart through paranoid brutality and systematic terror. Born in 1530 into the twilight of medieval Russia, young Ivan inherited a throne that commanded more territory than any Christian kingdom on earth, yet remained desperately insecure, surrounded by enemies both foreign and domestic. His father, Vasily III, had continued the work of his predecessors in gathering the Russian lands under Muscovite rule, but the process remained incomplete and fragile. When Vasily died in 1533, leaving 3-year-old Ivan as heir, the regency that followed revealed all the weaknesses of a system dependent on personal authority and blood legitimacy. The boy who would become the terrible Tsar learned his first lessons in power through watching his mother, Elena Glinskaya, navigate the treacherous world of boyar politics. The great noble families, the Świeckis, the Belskis, the Glinaskis circled the throne like wolves around a wounded deer, each seeking to use the child ruler as a puppet for their own ambitions. When Elena died suddenly in 1538, possibly poisoned by rival factions, 8-year-old Ivan found himself truly alone in a court where alliances shifted daily, and today's protector might become tomorrow's executioner. The regency period that followed was marked by chaos and violence that would scar Ivan's psyche permanently. Rival boyar clans fought openly in the Kremlin's halls, sometimes literally dragging political enemies from Ivan's presence to be murdered in adjacent rooms. The young Tsar was alternately pampered and neglected, treated as a sacred figure one day and ignored like a tiresome child the next. Contemporary accounts describe him as an intelligent but increasingly disturbed boy who tortured small animals for entertainment and showed early signs of the explosive rage that would later terrorize all Russia. When Ivan finally declared his majority in 1547 and assumed personal rule, he seemed initially determined to prove himself a worthy heir to his grandfather Ivan the Great. His coronation as Tsar, a title derived from Caesar, that claimed imperial status equal to the Byzantine emperors, was a magnificent ceremony that announced Moscow's pretensions to leadership of the Orthodox world. His early reforms showed promise: a new law code, military modernization, administrative reorganization that reduced boyar privileges while strengthening central authority. The conquest of Kazan in 1552 established Ivan's reputation as a military leader and expanded Russian territory significantly into the Tatar heartland. The siege was a masterpiece of 16th-century warfare, combining traditional Russian siege tactics with imported European artillery and engineering expertise. When the city finally fell after a 2-month siege, Ivan's treatment of the conquered population was relatively restrained by the standards of his age-mass enslavement rather than mass slaughter, cultural suppression rather than genocide. But beneath the surface of these early successes, darker currents were already stirring. Ivan's marriage to Anastasia Romanovna in 1547 had provided him with personal stability and competent advice, but her death in 1560 removed the one person capable of moderating his increasingly paranoid and violent impulses. The Tsar became convinced that his wife had been poisoned by boyar conspirators, and his subsequent behavior suggests that grief and suspicion had combined to unbalance a mind already predisposed to extremes. The creation of the Oprichnina in 1565 marked the point at which Ivan's reign transformed from conventional autocracy into systematic terror. This parallel state within the state was ostensibly designed to provide the Tsar with a reliable power base, independent of the traditional boyar hierarchy. But in practice it became an instrument of arbitrary violence that turned half of Russia into a theater of horror. The Oprichniki Ivan's black-clad horsemen who carried dogs' heads and brooms as symbols of their mission to sniff out treason and sweep away the Tsar's enemies operated according to a logic that was part religious fanaticism, part political calculation, and part pure sadism. They were organized like a monastic order, with Ivan himself serving as abbot, but their devotions included practices that would have horrified genuine monks. Their raids on boyar estates often resembled the savage attacks of nomadic raiders, complete with mass rape, torture of prisoners, and the systematic destruction of property. The sack of Novgorod in 1570 revealed the full extent of Ivan's paranoid fury and the Oprichnina's capacity for organized atrocity. Convinced that the ancient commercial city was plotting to defect to Poland-Lithuania, Ivan descended on Novgorod with several thousand Oprichniki and regular troops. For 5 weeks, they systematically murdered the city's inhabitants, using methods that seemed designed more to terrorize than to simply kill. Contemporary accounts describe horrors that strain credibility. Entire families roasted alive in specially constructed ovens, prisoners flayed and then forced to dance until they died from blood loss, children thrown to starving dogs while their parents watched. The Volkhov River allegedly ran red with blood, and the stench of decomposing corpses could be smelled for miles downwind. Conservative estimates place the death toll at 15,000, though some sources suggest twice that number perished in the orgy of violence. Perhaps most chilling was Ivan's personal participation in the massacre. Unlike many tyrants who delegated their cruelties to subordinates, the terrible Tsar took an active role in designing and implementing tortures, reportedly showing particular creativity in devising methods of execution that would maximize suffering while providing entertainment for his followers. He combined religious ritual with sadistic violence, ordering prayers before executions and treating the systematic murder of his subjects as a form of divine service. The psychological toll of constant violence began to show in Ivan's increasingly erratic behavior. Court chroniclers describe a man who alternated between periods of manic energy and deep depression, who could shift from paternal kindness to homicidal rage within moments. His treatment of subordinates became so unpredictable that boyars and officials lived in constant terror of saying or doing something that might trigger an explosive outburst. The most tragic example of Ivan's uncontrolled fury came in 1581, when he struck and killed his eldest son and heir, Ivan Ivanovich, during an argument over military policy. Contemporary accounts suggest that the Tsar immediately regretted his action, spending hours cradling his dying son's body while begging for forgiveness. But the damage was irreversible. Ivan had eliminated his most capable heir and thrown the succession into chaos, setting the stage for the time of troubles that would follow his death. Yet even as Ivan terrorized his own subjects, he continued to expand Russian territory and strengthen the state's institutional foundations. The conquest of Siberia, largely accomplished by private armies of Cossacks acting with loose government authorization, added vast new territories rich in furs and natural resources. Administrative reforms created a more efficient system of provincial government, while military modernization gradually transformed the Russian army into a force capable of competing with Western European powers. This contradiction between state-building achievement and personal monstrosity lies at the heart of Ivan's historical legacy. His reign established many of the principles that would define Russian autocracy for centuries: the absolute authority of the Tsar, the subordination of all social classes to state service, the use of terror as a routine instrument of governance, and the expansion of Russian power through a combination of diplomacy, military force, and colonization. The Russian Orthodox Church, which had initially supported Ivan's claims to divine authority, found itself increasingly uncomfortable with a ruler whose actions seemed to contradict basic Christian teachings. Yet church leaders largely remained silent, unwilling to challenge a Tsar who claimed to rule by God's will and who had demonstrated his willingness to destroy any institution that questioned his authority. When Ivan finally died in 1584, possibly during a game of chess with a court favorite, he left behind a realm that was simultaneously larger and weaker than the one he had inherited. His territorial conquests had expanded Russian borders significantly, but his domestic policies had devastated the very social and economic foundations that sustained state power. The boyar class had been decimated, the merchant class terrorized into submission, and the peasantry reduced to serfdom as a desperate attempt to prevent population flight from the violence and taxation of Ivan's reign. The immediate aftermath of Ivan's death proved how thoroughly his policies had undermined Russian stability. His heir, the weak and possibly mentally impaired Fyodor I, was unable to control the competing factions that emerged as the Oprichnina was dissolved. Within 2 decades, Russia would descend into the time of troubles, a period of civil war, foreign invasion, and dynastic crisis that nearly destroyed the state Ivan had worked so hard to strengthen. Yet paradoxically, Ivan's reign also established the template for Russian recovery from this chaos. The centralized autocracy he created, with its emphasis on service to the state and submission to the Tsar's will, provided the institutional framework that later rulers would use to rebuild Russian power. Peter the Great, Catherine II, and even Stalin would follow patterns of governance that Ivan IV had established: the use of terror to eliminate opposition, the subordination of all social institutions to state authority, and the expansion of Russian influence through a combination of military conquest and administrative efficiency. In Russian cultural memory, Ivan the Terrible occupies a uniquely complex position. He is simultaneously reviled as a monster and celebrated as a great ruler, condemned for his cruelties and praised for his achievements. This ambivalence reflects a broader tension in Russian political culture between the desire for strong leadership and the recognition that such strength often comes at a terrible human cost. The terrible Tsar had forged modern Russia in the fires of systematic violence, creating a state that would endure for centuries, but at a price that still echoes through Russian history. His reign demonstrated that terror could indeed serve as an effective instrument of statecraft, but also that rulers who govern through fear must ultimately face the consequences of their own methods. In the end, Ivan IV had succeeded in transforming a collection of feudal principalities into a unified Russian state. But the methods he used to achieve this transformation had scarred the Russian psyche in ways that would influence the country's political development for generations to come. The terrible crown he wore had grown heavier with each atrocity, until it became not just a symbol of authority, but a burden that would crush anyone who dared to claim it. Leopold II, the Butcher of the Congo. In the gaslit drawing rooms of late 19th century Europe, where gentlemen in tailcoats discussed the white man's burden over brandy and cigars, one figure managed to disguise genocide as philanthropy with such skill that he nearly escaped historical judgment entirely. Leopold II of Belgium, a monarch whose personal ambition and calculated cruelty would transform the heart of Africa into a charnel house, represents perhaps the most successful example of how civilized appearances can mask barbarism on an unprecedented scale. Born in 1835 into the comfortable world of European royalty, Leopold seemed destined for the kind of inconsequential reign that characterized most constitutional monarchs of his era. Belgium itself was barely older than its future king, having gained independence from the Netherlands in 1830, and the country's limited size and resources offered little scope for grand ambitions. Yet from his earliest years, Leopold displayed an insatiable hunger for territory and wealth that would not be satisfied by ribbon-cutting ceremonies and state dinners. The young prince's education included extensive travel throughout Europe and the Near East, exposing him to the wealth that colonial empires were generating for their European masters. He watched with envy as Britain and France expanded their overseas territories, bringing home fortunes in gold, ivory, and exotic goods that transformed their economies and funded magnificent public works. Belgium, with no colonial empire of its own, remained a minor player on the European stage despite its strategic location and industrial development. When Leopold ascended to the throne in 1865, he inherited a prosperous but unremarkable kingdom that seemed to offer little outlet for his grandiose dreams. The Belgian constitution severely limited royal power, making domestic adventures impossible, while the country's neighbors showed no interest in territorial concessions that might satisfy the new king's ambitions. If Leopold wanted an empire, he would have to create one himself, using methods that circumvented both constitutional restrictions and international oversight. The solution came to him as he studied reports from explorers like Henry Morton Stanley, whose expeditions were mapping the vast river systems of Central Africa. Here was a territory larger than Western Europe, rich in natural resources, inhabited by peoples who lacked the military technology to resist European conquest, and claimed by no major power. All it needed was the right approach that would disguise naked exploitation as humanitarian mission and personal enrichment as civilizing work. In 1876, Leopold convened the Brussels Geographic Conference, ostensibly dedicated to coordinating international efforts to suppress the slave trade and bring civilization to Africa. The conference established the International African Association, with Leopold as its president, creating the perfect vehicle for his ambitions. Under the banner of humanitarian concern and scientific exploration, he could claim territory and establish commercial operations while maintaining the fiction that his interests were entirely altruistic. The Congo Free State that emerged from these machinations was perhaps the most audacious fraud in the history of imperialism. Recognized by the major powers at the Berlin Conference of 1884–85, it was presented as an international philanthropic project dedicated to free trade and the abolition of slavery. In reality, it was Leopold's private kingdom, a territory 76 times larger than Belgium, that he ruled with absolute authority while skimming its wealth for his personal use. The system Leopold established in the Congo was ingeniously simple and devastatingly effective. Rather than attempting to administer such a vast territory directly, he divided it into concessions controlled by private companies that paid him tribute in return for the right to extract resources. These companies were staffed primarily by Europeans, but relied on African labor that was obtained through methods that made slavery seem humane by comparison. The rubber boom of the 1890s transformed Leopold's African experiment from a modest, profitable venture into a source of almost unimaginable wealth. Wild rubber trees grew throughout the Congo basin, and the growing demand for rubber in Europe and America created unprecedented opportunities for profit. But harvesting rubber required intensive manual labor, and the Congolese population showed understandable reluctance to abandon their traditional ways of life to work for foreign companies at subsistence wages. Leopold's solution was the quota system, a method of resource extraction that combined economic incentives with systematic terror to ensure maximum productivity. Each village was assigned a quota of rubber that had to be delivered monthly, with failure to meet targets resulting in punishments that escalated from beatings to mutilation to mass murder. Company agents, backed by the force public Leopold's private army, recruited from other parts of Africa enforced these quotas with a brutality that defied belief. The signature atrocity of Leopold's Congo was the systematic amputation of hands, initially used as proof that expensive ammunition had been used to kill rebels, rather than wasted on hunting animals. But the practice soon evolved into a form of terrorism designed to ensure compliance with rubber quotas. Villages that failed to meet their targets might find company agents returning with baskets full of severed hands, sometimes from the village's own children, who had been mutilated as punishment for their parents' shortcomings. Missionary reports and photographs began to reach Europe by the early 1900s, revealing the true nature of Leopold's civilizing mission. Images of children with amputated hands, families starved to death for failing to meet quotas, and entire regions depopulated by violence and disease slowly penetrated the carefully maintained wall of propaganda that had protected Leopold's reputation for decades. The most damaging revelations came from Edmund Morel, a British shipping clerk who noticed that ships leaving for the Congo carried only weapons and military supplies, while returning vessels were loaded with rubber and ivory. His mathematical analysis of this trade imbalance led him to conclude that the wealth of the Congo was being extracted entirely through forced labor, with no significant trade goods being provided in return. Morel's campaign, supported by missionary organizations and humanitarian groups, gradually built international pressure for reform in the Congo. The formation of the Congo Reform Association in 1904 marked the beginning of what may have been the first international human rights campaign in modern history, using photography, eyewitness testimony, and carefully documented evidence to expose the reality behind Leopold's humanitarian facade. Yet Leopold proved remarkably skilled at deflecting criticism and maintaining his profitable operations even as international pressure mounted. He hired public relations experts, funded sympathetic journalists, and created a network of humanitarian organizations that existed primarily to provide cover for his activities. When forced to acknowledge abuses, he blamed overzealous subordinates while claiming that his own intentions remained purely philanthropic. The king's personal lifestyle provided stark contrast to the humanitarian image he cultivated publicly. The wealth extracted from Congo slave labor funded magnificent construction projects throughout Belgium, including parks, monuments, and public buildings that transformed Brussels into one of Europe's most beautiful capitals. Leopold's personal expenditures were equally lavish. He maintained multiple mistresses, built palatial residences, and acquired art collections that rivaled those of far wealthier monarchs. Conservative estimates suggest that Leopold's rule in the Congo resulted in the deaths of 10 million people, or half the territory's original population. This catastrophe was achieved not through dramatic military campaigns or industrial killing methods, but through the systematic application of economic pressure backed by carefully calibrated violence. Villages were destroyed not to eliminate enemies but to terrorize survivors into compliance with rubber quotas. The demographic collapse of Central Africa during Leopold's reign had consequences that extended far beyond the immediate human cost. Traditional political and social structures were shattered, educational and cultural systems were destroyed, and entire generations grew up knowing only violence and exploitation. The Congo that Leopold finally handed over to the Belgian state in 1908 was a broken territory that would struggle for decades to recover from the systematic devastation of his rule. The international campaign that eventually forced Leopold to relinquish control of the Congo established important precedents for human rights advocacy and international intervention. For the first time in history, a coordinated international movement had successfully challenged the sovereign rights of a recognized ruler based purely on humanitarian concerns. The techniques developed by Morel and his allies' photographic evidence, eyewitness testimony, statistical analysis, and coordinated media campaigns would later be used by human rights organizations throughout the 20th century. Yet Leopold's ultimate punishment was remarkably light, considering the scale of his crimes. He received financial compensation for surrendering control of the Congo, allowing him to maintain his luxurious lifestyle until his death in 1909. He was never prosecuted for crimes against humanity, a legal concept that did not yet exist, and his reputation was largely rehabilitated within Belgium through carefully orchestrated propaganda that emphasized his contributions to Belgian prosperity and international prestige. The Belgian state that inherited the Congo initially promised reforms but proved only marginally better than Leopold's private regime. The same companies continued to operate under government oversight rather than royal control, and many of the same practices continued under different names. The fundamental relationship between European owners and African laborers remained essentially unchanged, with violence and economic coercion still serving as the primary tools of resource extraction. Leopold's Congo represented a new form of imperialism that would influence colonial practices throughout Africa and beyond. Unlike traditional conquests that sought to establish permanent settlement or direct political control, Leopold's system focused entirely on resource extraction through the systematic application of economic pressure. This model would be copied by other colonial powers, leading to similar atrocities in German Southwest Africa, Portuguese Angola, and French Equatorial Africa. The king's success in maintaining international legitimacy, despite overwhelming evidence of atrocities, also established a template for how authoritarian leaders could manipulate international opinion through propaganda and institutional manipulation. Leopold's techniques creating humanitarian organizations to provide cover for exploitation, hiring public relations experts to shape media coverage, and blaming subordinates for systematic abuses would be refined and expanded by later dictators facing international criticism. In the end, Leopold II had demonstrated that genocide could be profitably conducted under the guise of civilization, that systematic atrocities could be disguised as humanitarian missions, and that international law and moral pressure were insufficient to protect vulnerable populations from determined exploitation. His reign in the Congo became a case study in how apparently civilized societies could participate in or ignore mass atrocities when economic interests were at stake. The butcher of the Congo had pioneered a form of remote-controlled tyranny that maximized profit while minimizing international accountability. His legacy lived on not just in the devastated communities of Central Africa, but in the institutional and ideological frameworks that would enable future atrocities throughout the colonial and post-colonial world. The gentleman king had proven that monsters need not foam at the mouth or proclaim their evil intentions. Sometimes the most dangerous tyrants are those who convince the world, and perhaps even themselves, that their cruelties serve a higher purpose. Abdul Hamid II, the Red Sultan. In the twilight of the Ottoman Empire, when the sick man of Europe gasped for breath, while younger, hungrier powers circled like vultures, one man would attempt to preserve the dying empire through a combination of paranoid surveillance and systematic massacre that earned him a title written in blood: Abdul Hamid II, the Red Sultan. His reign from 876 to 1909 marked the final desperate attempt to halt Ottoman decline through the tools of absolute autocracy, religious manipulation, and carefully orchestrated terror that would prefigure the genocidal policies of the following century. Born in 1842 into the Imperial Ottoman dynasty, Abdul Hamid came of age during a period of accelerating crisis that seemed to threaten the very survival of the empire his ancestors had built. The Crimean War had exposed Ottoman military weakness, the Congress of Berlin had stripped away crucial territories, and nationalist movements throughout the Balkans were systematically dismantling Ottoman control over Christian populations that had been subjects of the Sublime Porte for centuries. The young prince's education reflected the Ottoman elite's desperate attempt to modernize their institutions while preserving their essential character. He learned French and studied European political systems, but he also immersed himself in Islamic theology and Ottoman administrative traditions. This dual education would later manifest in a ruling style that combined modern surveillance techniques with medieval concepts of divine authority, creating a system of control that was both innovative and atavistic. When Abdul Hamid ascended to the throne in 1876, he initially appeared to embrace the reformist agenda that had dominated Ottoman politics for the previous half-century. His first official act was to promulgate a constitution that established parliamentary government and guaranteed civil rights to all Ottoman subjects regardless of religion or ethnicity. European observers hailed this development as evidence that the Ottoman Empire was finally joining the modern world of constitutional monarchy and representative government. But the constitutional experiment lasted barely 2 years before Abdul Hamid suspended parliament and began constructing what would become one of history's most sophisticated surveillance states. The Sultan had concluded that constitutionalism was a luxury the dying empire could not afford, that parliamentary debate and press freedom would only provide additional opportunities for separatist movements to organize and foreign powers to interfere in Ottoman affairs. The system that emerged was a masterpiece of authoritarian control that combined traditional Ottoman administrative methods with modern communication technology. The Sultan's spy network, centered on the palace but extending throughout the empire, monitored not just potential rebels and foreign agents but ordinary citizens whose loyalty might be suspect. Telegraph lines allowed near-instantaneous communication between Constantinople and provincial governors, while the expanding railway network enabled rapid deployment of troops to suppress disturbances before they could spread. Abdul Hamid's approach to preserving Ottoman unity relied heavily on Islamic identity as a unifying force that could transcend ethnic and linguistic divisions. His adoption of the title Caliph Commander of the Faithful was not merely ceremonial but reflected a genuine attempt to rally Muslim populations around religious rather than nationalist loyalties. Pan-Islamic propaganda emanated from Constantinople, encouraging Muslim minorities in European colonies to view the Ottoman Sultan as their spiritual leader and potential liberator. This religious strategy had a dark corollary in the Sultan's treatment of Christian minorities, who were increasingly viewed as fifth columns, whose loyalty to foreign powers made them inherent threats to Ottoman security. The fact that many Christian communities had indeed welcomed Russian intervention during recent wars only reinforced the Sultan's suspicions that religious minorities could never be trusted as fully loyal Ottoman subjects. The Armenian massacres of 1894–96 revealed both the systematic nature of Abdul Hamid's persecution policies and his skill at manipulating international opinion to minimize consequences. The killings began in response to Armenian demands for administrative reforms and protection from Kurdish raids, but they quickly escalated into a coordinated campaign of terror that claimed an estimated 200 lives across the eastern provinces of the empire. What made these massacres particularly chilling was their organized nature. Rather than spontaneous outbursts of religious or ethnic hatred, they followed carefully planned scripts that maximized terror while minimizing evidence of government involvement. Local officials would spread rumors of Armenian revolutionary activity, Kurdish irregulars would attack Armenian villages, while regular troops looked the other way, and then the same officials would report that they had restored order after unfortunate intercommunal violence. The Sultan's propaganda machine worked overtime to present these atrocities as defensive measures against Armenian terrorism and foreign manipulation. European sympathy for the victims was dismissed as the product of biased missionary reports and great power meddling in Ottoman internal affairs. Abdul Hamid skillfully exploited European rivalries, ensuring that no single power could organize effective intervention by playing British, French, and Russian interests against each other. The palace from which Abdul Hamid ruled became a fortress of paranoia, where courtiers lived in constant fear of surveillance and arbitrary punishment. The Sultan trusted no one completely, rotating officials frequently to prevent the formation of power centers that might threaten his authority. Even his personal servants were subject to constant monitoring, and the imperial family itself was kept under house arrest to prevent potential succession disputes. This atmosphere of suspicion extended to the Sultan's own person, as Abdul Hamid became increasingly reclusive and fearful of assassination attempts. He rarely left the palace grounds, employed multiple food tasters to guard against poisoning, and surrounded himself with layers of security that made spontaneous contact with his subjects virtually impossible. The empire was governed by a man who seemed to fear his own people as much as he feared foreign enemies. The economic consequences of Abdul Hamid's rule were devastating for ordinary Ottomans, who found themselves crushed between the fiscal demands of maintaining the Sultan's vast security apparatus and the need to service the empire's crushing foreign debt. Tax collection became increasingly arbitrary and brutal, while the lack of investment in productive infrastructure left the Ottoman economy even further behind its European competitors. Yet the Sultan's system of control proved remarkably durable, surviving multiple coup attempts and continuing economic crises through a combination of surveillance, selective violence, and skilled manipulation of ethnic and religious divisions. The fact that the empire held together at all during this period of accelerating decline testified to the effectiveness of Abdul Hamid's authoritarian methods, even as those same methods ensured that the empire could never fully modernize or compete with its European rivals. The revolution that finally toppled Abdul Hamid in 1908 came not from the oppressed minorities he had persecuted, but from within the Ottoman military and bureaucratic elite itself. The Young Turk movement represented a generational revolt against the Sultan's paranoid authoritarianism, but ironically, many of its leaders had learned their organizational and ideological lessons from the very system they sought to overthrow. The Committee of Union and Progress that dominated Ottoman politics after 1908 would prove even more ruthless than Abdul Hamid in pursuing nationalist policies that culminated in the Armenian Genocide of 1915. The Young Turks had absorbed the Red Sultan's lesson that ethnic minorities posed existential threats to state survival, but they possessed a more modern understanding of how to implement systematic persecution without arousing effective international opposition. Abdul Hamid's exile to Thessalonica, where he lived comfortably under house arrest until his death in 1918, provided a stark contrast to the fate of many who had opposed his rule. The former Sultan spent his final years reading newspapers and receiving carefully vetted visitors, insulated from the consequences of policies that had devastated millions of lives throughout his former empire. The Red Sultan's legacy extended far beyond the Ottoman Empire's borders, as his techniques for managing ethnic conflict and controlling dissent were studied and adapted by authoritarian leaders throughout the 20th century. His combination of surveillance, propaganda, and selective massacre provided a template for how modern states could pursue genocidal policies while maintaining international legitimacy. In many ways, Abdul Hamid II represented a transitional figure between traditional autocracy and modern totalitarianism. His methods were more systematic than those of earlier despots, but less technologically sophisticated than those of later dictators. He pioneered techniques for manipulating international opinion and managing ethnic conflict that would be refined and expanded by the totalitarian movements of the following century. The Red Sultan had attempted to save his empire through the systematic application of terror, but in the end, he had only succeeded in establishing precedents for how states could murder their own subjects while claiming to defend civilization itself. His reign demonstrated that modernization and massacre could proceed hand in hand, that technological progress could serve genocidal purposes as easily as humanitarian ones. In the end, Abdul Hamid's greatest achievement was negative. He had shown how traditional empires could adapt to the modern world by embracing the darkest possibilities of state power. The surveillance state he created, the propaganda techniques he developed, and the systematic persecution he orchestrated would all be studied and improved upon by future dictators who possessed even fewer scruples and even greater technical capabilities. The Red Sultan had earned his crimson title through rivers of blood, but the deeper stain was on the concept of sovereignty itself, the idea that rulers could commit any atrocity against their own subjects without facing meaningful consequences from the international community. Benito Mussolini, Il Duce of Fear. In the rubble-strewn aftermath of the Great War, when traditional political systems lay shattered across Europe and desperate populations searched for salvation in radical ideologies, one man would transform himself from a socialist journalist into the archetype of fascist dictatorship. Benito Mussolini, Il Duce of Italy, created the template for 20th-century authoritarianism through a combination of theatrical politics, systematic violence, and the cynical manipulation of national grievances that would inspire imitators from Berlin to Buenos Aires. Born in 1883 in the small town of Pradapio, Mussolini seemed destined for a career as a provincial schoolteacher or minor intellectual, rather than as the creator of a political movement that would reshape European civilization. His father Alessandro was a blacksmith and committed socialist who named his son after Benito Juarez, the Mexican revolutionary president. His mother Rosa was a devout Catholic and elementary school teacher who provided the family's primary income and intellectual guidance. Young Benito's early life was marked by violence and instability that foreshadowed his later career. He was expelled from multiple schools for assaulting other students and teachers, demonstrating an explosive temper that would become his trademark. Yet he also displayed considerable intellectual gifts, mastering classical Latin and developing the rhetorical skills that would later mesmerize millions of Italians desperate for strong leadership. His early political career followed the typical trajectory of European socialist intellectuals: journalism, labor organizing, and fierce opposition to militarism and nationalism. As editor of Avanti, the official newspaper of the Italian Socialist Party, Mussolini initially opposed Italian entry into World War I, arguing that the conflict represented nothing more than imperialist rivalry between capitalist powers that would be fought with workers' blood for their master's profit. But the war that began in 1914 transformed Mussolini as completely as it transformed Europe itself. Gradually convinced that Italian participation might accelerate the revolutionary transformation of society, he broke with his former comrades and began advocating for intervention on the side of Britain and France. This apostasy led to his expulsion from the Socialist Party and the beginning of his evolution toward the unique ideology that would become known as fascism. The Italy that emerged from the Great War was a nation exhausted by victory, frustrated by the peace settlement, and terrorized by the possibility of socialist revolution. Despite fighting on the winning side, Italy had gained relatively little territory and suffered enormous casualties. The economy was in ruins, unemployment was skyrocketing, and armed groups of both left and right were fighting in the streets of major cities. Mussolini's genius lay in recognizing that this crisis created opportunities for a new kind of political movement that could appeal to both nationalist sentiment and social radicalism while rejecting the internationalism of socialism and the conservatism of traditional right-wing parties. The Fasci di Combattimento combat squads that he founded in 1919 combined the revolutionary rhetoric of the left with the patriotic symbols of the right, creating something genuinely new in European politics. The black shirts, who formed the backbone of Mussolini's movement, were recruited primarily from war veterans who felt betrayed by the peace settlement and threatened by socialist attempts to discredit their service. These men had learned violence as a trade during 4 years of trench warfare, and they applied their skills with devastating effectiveness against socialist organizers, striking workers, and anyone else who seemed to threaten the established order. The systematic destruction of socialist and Catholic trade unions throughout northern Italy in 2022 revealed both the effectiveness of fascist violence and the complicity of traditional conservative politicians who saw Mussolini's squadristi as useful allies against the revolutionary left. Local police and military commanders often stood aside while black shirts attacked union headquarters, burned newspaper offices, and beat opposition activists to death in public squares. Mussolini's march on Rome in October 1922 was as much theatrical performance as political action, designed to demonstrate fascist strength while providing cover for the backroom negotiations that actually brought him to power. King Victor Emmanuel III's decision to appoint Mussolini as prime minister, rather than risk civil war, marked the beginning of democracy's collapse in the country that had given birth to the Renaissance. The transformation from constitutional government to dictatorship proceeded gradually, as Mussolini systematically dismantled democratic institutions while maintaining the fiction of legal continuity. The Acerbo Law of 1923 ensured fascist electoral dominance through gerrymandering and violence, while the murder of socialist deputy Giacomo Matteotti in 1924 demonstrated the fate awaiting those who dared to challenge the new regime publicly. By 1925, Mussolini had abandoned any pretense of constitutional government and begun constructing the totalitarian state that would serve as a model for Hitler's Germany and Franco's Spain. The secret police, expanded censorship, and mass surveillance created an atmosphere of fear that stifled opposition, while fascist propaganda celebrated the rebirth of Italian greatness under Il Duce's inspired leadership. The invasion of Ethiopia in 1935 revealed both Mussolini's imperial ambitions and his willingness to employ methods that shocked even the cynical diplomats of European colonial powers. The use of poison gas against Ethiopian forces violated international law and demonstrated fascist contempt for the humanitarian constraints that supposedly governed civilized warfare. More disturbing was the systematic targeting of civilians, including the bombing of Red Cross hospitals and the execution of prisoners who had surrendered under international protection. The Ethiopian War also marked the beginning of Mussolini's alliance with Hitler, as the two dictators discovered their shared contempt for democratic weakness and international law. The Rome-Berlin axis that emerged from this partnership would reshape European politics and drag the continent into another devastating war within a generation of the previous conflict. Mussolini's introduction of racial laws in 1938, modeled closely on Nazi legislation, completed his transformation from socialist revolutionary to fascist dictator. The persecution of Italian Jews, who had been among the most assimilated Jewish populations in Europe, demonstrated the regime's willingness to sacrifice longtime citizens to ideological purity and German diplomatic pressure. The decision to enter World War II in 1940 proved to be Mussolini's fatal miscalculation, as Italy's military forces proved woefully unprepared for modern warfare against determined opponents. Defeats in Greece, North Africa, and the Soviet Union revealed the hollowness of fascist propaganda about Italian military superiority and the restoration of Roman greatness. As Allied forces advanced up the Italian peninsula in 1943, the facade of popular support for fascism collapsed with stunning rapidity. Mussolini's own Grand Council voted him out of office, and King Victor Emmanuel III ordered his arrest, ending more than 2 decades of dictatorship through a palace coup that demonstrated how fragile authoritarian legitimacy can become when based primarily on success and intimidation. The gruesome end came in April 1945, when communist partisans captured Mussolini and his mistress Clara Petacci as they attempted to flee to Switzerland. Their execution and the subsequent public display of their corpses in Milan's Piazzale Loreto provided a fitting conclusion to a regime that had begun with street violence and ended with the same brutal methods it had employed against its enemies. Yet Mussolini's influence extended far beyond his own regime's boundaries or lifespan. The fascist movement he created pioneered techniques of mass mobilization, propaganda, and political theater that would be copied by authoritarian movements throughout the 20th century. His combination of radical rhetoric with conservative practice, nationalist symbolism with modernist aesthetics, and populist appeals with elite manipulation became the standard template for successful dictatorships. Perhaps most significantly, Mussolini demonstrated that democratic institutions could be destroyed gradually through legal means, that constitutional governments could be transformed into dictatorships without dramatic coups or revolutionary upheavals. His techniques for manipulating electoral systems, controlling media, and intimidating opposition provided a roadmap that later authoritarians would follow with even greater success. The corporate state that Mussolini claimed to have created as an alternative to both capitalism and socialism proved to be largely fictional, existing mainly in propaganda rather than reality. But the idea that dictatorships could offer economic efficiency and social harmony as alternatives to democratic disorder would be recycled by countless authoritarians who promised to transcend traditional political divisions through strong leadership and national unity. Il Duce had pioneered the art of political theater, transforming government into a form of mass entertainment where dramatic gestures and symbolic victories substituted for genuine policy achievements. His balcony speeches, synchronized mass rallies, and carefully choreographed public appearances established the visual vocabulary of modern dictatorship that would be refined by Hitler, Stalin, and their countless imitators. In the end, Mussolini's greatest achievement was negative. He had shown how easily democratic societies could be seduced by authoritarian alternatives when faced with economic crisis and social upheaval. His rise to power demonstrated that dictatorship was not an aberration confined to backward societies, but a permanent possibility within modern civilization itself. The Duce of Fear had created fascism as a political movement, but more importantly, he had revealed the fascist potential that lay dormant within apparently stable democratic societies. His legacy was not just the specific policies of his regime, but the proof that civilized nations could choose barbarism when presented with sufficiently compelling alternatives to the messy compromises of democratic government. Adolf Hitler, the architect of genocide. In the pantheon of human evil, where tyrants compete for recognition across the millennia, one name stands apart not merely for the scale of his crimes but for their systematic, industrialized nature that transformed murder into a matter of bureaucratic efficiency. Adolf Hitler, the failed Austrian artist who became Germany's Führer, represents the apotheosis of 20th century totalitarianism, a man whose personal pathologies became state policy, whose racial obsessions became genocide, and whose political genius lay in recognizing how thoroughly he could exploit the darkest impulses of human nature. Born in 1889 in the provincial Austrian town of Braunau am Inn, young Adolf seemed destined for obscurity as the son of a minor customs official in the polyglot Habsburg Empire. His early life was marked by the kind of middle-class mediocrity that breeds resentment rather than ambition. A stern, authoritarian father who died when Adolf was 13. A doting mother whose death from breast cancer in 1907 left him emotionally devastated, and a series of failures that included rejection from the Vienna Academy of Fine Arts and years of poverty in the cosmopolitan capital that he would later claim had taught him to hate Jews. The Vienna of Hitler's youth was a laboratory of ethnic nationalism and anti-Semitism, where politicians like Caligula had pioneered the techniques of mass manipulation that Hitler would later perfect. The city's toxic mixture of German nationalism, pan-German ideology, and pseudo-scientific racial theory provided the intellectual framework for ideas that would eventually consume Europe in flames. Hitler absorbed these concepts during his years as a failed artist and bohemian drifter, synthesizing them into a worldview that combined traditional anti-Semitism with modern ideas about racial hygiene and social Darwinism. The Great War that began in 1914 provided Hitler with the purpose and identity that had eluded him in civilian life. His service as a dispatch runner on the Western Front was undistinguished but adequate, earning him minor decorations and, more importantly, a sense of belonging to something greater than himself. The war's end found him temporarily blinded by gas attack in a military hospital, where news of Germany's defeat reportedly triggered a nervous breakdown that he would later describe as a mystical experience calling him to political action. The Germany that emerged from military defeat and revolutionary upheaval provided the perfect environment for Hitler's brand of radical politics. The Treaty of Versailles had imposed crushing reparations and territorial losses that humiliated a proud nation accustomed to viewing itself as the pinnacle of European civilization. Hyperinflation wiped out middle-class savings, while political violence between left and right extremists made democratic government seem impossibly weak and ineffective. Hitler's entry into politics came through his assignment to monitor extremist groups for the army, a task that brought him into contact with the tiny German Workers' Party that would become the nucleus of the Nazi movement. His discovery of his own oratorical abilities transformed both the party and Hitler himself, as he found in political speaking the artistic expression that had been denied him in painting. His speeches tapped into the deep wells of resentment and frustration that characterized post-war German society, offering simple explanations for complex problems and violent solutions for perceived injustices. The Beer Hall Putsch of 1923 marked both the nadir and the turning point of Hitler's early career. His attempted coup in Munich failed spectacularly, resulting in his arrest and trial for treason. But the trial itself became a propaganda triumph that transformed a local agitator into a national figure. Hitler used the courtroom as a platform to articulate his political philosophy and present himself as the voice of betrayed German nationalism, turning legal defeat into political victory. The 8 months Hitler spent in Landsberg prison proved crucial to his intellectual development and political strategy. During his comfortable confinement, he dictated the first volume of Mein Kampf to Rudolf Hess, codifying the racial ideology and political program that would guide the Nazi movement for the next quarter century. More importantly, he concluded that power must be won through legal means rather than revolutionary violence, a strategic insight that would prove decisive in his eventual rise to the chancellorship. The Nazi Party that emerged from the failed putsch was fundamentally different from the collection of beer hall conspirators and street fighters that had characterized the early movement. Hitler systematically constructed a parallel state within the Weimar Republic, complete with its own armed forces, propaganda apparatus, and administrative structure. The SA brown shirts provided muscle, the SS offered an elite guard of ideological fanatics, and the party bureaucracy created a shadow government ready to assume power when the opportunity arose. The propaganda techniques Hitler developed during the party's rise to power represented a revolution in political communication that combined modern technology with ancient appeals to tribal loyalty and racial pride. His rallies were carefully choreographed theatrical events designed to overwhelm rational thought through emotional manipulation, while Nazi propaganda exploited new media like radio and film to reach audiences far beyond the party faithful. The cult of personality that surrounded the Führer was deliberately constructed to present him as Germany's savior and destiny rolled into one charismatic figure. The economic crisis that began with the 1929 stock market crash provided Hitler with the opportunity he had been waiting for throughout the 1920s. As unemployment soared and democratic parties proved incapable of effective response, Nazi electoral support grew from a tiny minority to the largest single party in the Reichstag. The political maneuvering that brought Hitler to power in January 1933 demonstrated how democracy could be destroyed through legal means by politicians who fatally underestimated both his ruthlessness and his popular appeal. The transformation of Germany from constitutional republic to totalitarian dictatorship proceeded with breathtaking speed once Hitler gained access to state power. The Reichstag fire provided the pretext for emergency decrees that suspended civil liberties, while the Enabling Act gave Hitler's government the authority to pass laws without parliamentary approval. Within months, opposition parties were banned, trade unions were dissolved, and the federal structure of the German state was replaced by centralized Nazi control. The Night of the Long Knives in 1934 revealed Hitler's willingness to murder even his own followers when they became inconvenient to his larger political strategy. The execution of SA leader Ernst Röhm and hundreds of other early Nazis demonstrated that loyalty to Hitler was a one-way street that could be revoked at any moment. The purge also signaled to conservative politicians and military leaders that the Führer was willing to sacrifice radical elements within his own movement to secure their cooperation. The Nuremberg Laws of 1935 began the systematic legal persecution of German Jews that would eventually escalate into genocide. These laws stripped Jews of citizenship and civil rights while prohibiting marriage and sexual relations between Jews and Aryan Germans. What made the Nuremberg Laws particularly ominous was their bureaucratic precision, their careful definition of racial categories, and their integration into the normal legal system rather than their implementation through emergency measures. Kristallnacht, in November 1938, marked the transition from legal persecution to systematic violence as Nazi stormtroopers destroyed synagogues, Jewish businesses, and homes throughout Germany, while police and fire departments stood by on orders. The pogrom was presented as a spontaneous outburst of popular anger, but it was actually a carefully coordinated operation designed to terrorize the Jewish population while testing public reaction to anti-Jewish violence. The invasion of Poland in September 1939 initiated not just World War II but also the implementation of Nazi racial ideology on an unprecedented scale. The German occupation of Poland became a laboratory for policies that would later be extended throughout occupied Europe. The systematic murder of Polish intellectuals and clergy, the enslavement of the Polish population, and the concentration of Jews in ghettos that served as staging areas for eventual extermination. The decision to implement the final solution, the systematic murder of European Jewry, represented the culmination of Nazi racial ideology and Hitler's personal obsession with Jewish destruction. The Wannsee Conference of 1942 coordinated the bureaucratic machinery of genocide, transforming murder into an administrative task carried out by ordinary civil servants, policemen, and railroad officials who collectively implemented policies that individual conscience might have rejected. The Holocaust that resulted from these decisions was unprecedented not just in its scale, the murder of 6 million Jews, but in its industrial character. The death camps of Auschwitz-Birkenau, Treblinka, and Sobibor were designed as factories of death, where human beings were processed with the same efficiency that German industry brought to automobile production. The bureaucratic language that disguised murder as special treatment and resettlement demonstrated how civilized societies could participate in barbarism through the simple expedient of dividing moral responsibility among so many individuals that no one felt personally accountable. Yet the Holocaust was only the most visible aspect of Nazi genocide, which also targeted disabled individuals, Roma populations, Polish intellectuals, Soviet prisoners of war, and anyone else deemed racially or politically undesirable. The T4 euthanasia program that murdered disabled children and adults served as a testing ground for techniques later used in the death camps, while the systematic starvation of Soviet POWs claimed millions of lives that are often forgotten in discussions of Nazi atrocities. Hitler's conduct of World War II revealed the same combination of strategic insight and ideological fanaticism that had characterized his rise to power. His early military successes, the conquest of Poland, the fall of France, the occupation of Norway and the Low Countries, demonstrated genuine strategic vision and innovative tactical thinking. But his decision to invade the Soviet Union while Britain remained undefeated reflected the ideological imperatives that ultimately trumped rational calculation in Nazi decision-making. The Commissar Order and other directives for the conduct of war in Eastern Europe explicitly abandoned the legal and ethical constraints that had traditionally governed warfare between civilized nations. German soldiers were ordered to execute captured Soviet political officers, to treat civilian populations as potential enemies, and to exploit occupied territories with maximum ruthlessness regardless of international law. These policies transformed World War II from a conventional conflict into a racial war of extermination. As military defeat became inevitable, Hitler's response revealed the full extent of his nihilistic worldview and contempt for the German people who had failed to fulfill his vision of racial superiority. The Nero decree of March 1945 ordered the destruction of all German infrastructure that might be useful to advancing Allied forces, a policy that would have reduced Germany to pre-industrial conditions had it been fully implemented. Hitler's reasoning was chillingly simple. If the German people could not win the war, they had proven themselves unworthy of survival. The final act played out in the Führer bunker beneath Berlin as Soviet artillery reduced the Nazi capital to rubble overhead. Hitler's last will and testament, dictated hours before his suicide, remained unrepentant to the end, blaming Germany's defeat on international Jewry while calling on future generations to continue the racial struggle he had initiated. His marriage to Eva Braun and their joint suicide on April 30, 1945, provided a fittingly dramatic conclusion to a political career that had always prioritized theatrical gesture over substantive achievement. The immediate aftermath of Hitler's death revealed how completely his regime had been built around his personal authority and charismatic leadership. Nazi Germany collapsed within days of the Führer's suicide, as party officials and military commanders surrendered or fled, rather than continuing a struggle that had lost its central organizing principle. The Thousand-Year Reich had lasted 12 years, but those years had been sufficient to demonstrate the full potential of modern totalitarianism when guided by genocidal ideology and unlimited ambition. Hitler's legacy extended far beyond the immediate devastation of World War II and the Holocaust, to encompass a fundamental challenge to the optimistic assumptions of Enlightenment civilization. He had demonstrated that rational, educated, technologically advanced societies could choose barbarism when presented with sufficiently compelling narratives about racial superiority and historical destiny. The bureaucrats who organized deportations, the doctors who selected victims for murder, and the engineers who designed gas chambers were products of the same educational and cultural systems that had created Beethoven, Goethe, and Einstein. The Nuremberg trials established important precedents for international justice and individual accountability, but they could not answer the deeper questions raised by Nazi success in recruiting millions of ordinary Germans to participate in or acquiesce to genocidal policies. The ease with which Hitler had destroyed democracy, the efficiency with which Nazi bureaucrats had organized mass murder, and the enthusiasm with which German society had initially embraced Nazi ideology suggested that the potential for such evil was not unique to German culture, but represented a permanent possibility within modern civilization itself. In the end, Hitler's most terrifying achievement was not the specific crimes of his regime, but his demonstration that genocide could be implemented through normal administrative channels by ordinary people who convinced themselves they were serving a higher purpose. The architect of genocide had shown that the machinery of modern civilization could be turned to purposes of systematic destruction with the same efficiency that it brought to more benevolent objectives. The failed artist had succeeded beyond his wildest dreams in leaving a mark on human history, but it was a mark written in blood and ash that would serve as a permanent reminder of humanity's capacity for evil when freed from moral and legal constraints. His name had become synonymous with absolute evil, ensuring a form of immortality that was perhaps the most fitting punishment for a man who had sought to reshape the world in his own twisted image. Hideki Tōjō, Japan's executioner. In the land of the rising sun, where ancient traditions of honor and sacrifice had been forged into modern instruments of imperial expansion, one man would embody the transformation of Japanese militarism from personal code of conduct into industrial machinery of continental conquest. Hideki Tōjō, the bald, bespectacled general who became Japan's wartime prime minister, represented the culmination of a military culture that had convinced itself that aggression was defense, that conquest was liberation, and that the brutal subjugation of Asian peoples served the divine destiny of the Japanese race. Born in 1884 into the samurai class during the Meiji Restoration's revolutionary transformation of Japanese society, Tōjō came of age as his country struggled to reconcile traditional values with modern military technology. His father, Hidenori, was a career military officer who had served in the wars that established Japan as East Asia's dominant power, instilling in young Hideki the unshakable conviction that military service was the highest form of patriotic duty and that Japan's expansion across Asia was both inevitable and righteous. The Imperial Military Academy, where Tōjō received his education, functioned as a hothouse of nationalist ideology that fused traditional Bushido concepts with modern theories of racial superiority and geopolitical necessity. Students were taught that Japan's island geography and limited natural resources made territorial expansion essential for national survival, while the supposed racial inferiority of China and other Asian nations justified Japanese hegemony as a form of benevolent guidance for backward peoples who could not govern themselves effectively. Tōjō's early military career coincided with Japan's dramatic emergence as a regional power capable of challenging European colonial dominance throughout Asia. His service during the Russo-Japanese War of 1945 provided first-hand experience of modern warfare, while reinforcing his deeply held belief that Japanese spiritual superiority could overcome any material disadvantages. The stunning defeat of a European power by an Asian nation seemed to validate the nationalist ideology that portrayed Japan as destined to lead Asia's liberation from Western imperialism and racial degradation. The interwar period witnessed Tōjō's steady rise through the ranks of the Imperial Army's increasingly politicized officer corps, where radical nationalist factions competed fiercely for influence over Japanese foreign policy and domestic governance. As a staff officer in Manchuria during the turbulent 1930s, he played a crucial role in implementing the aggressive policies that transformed the puppet state of Manchukuo into a laboratory for Japanese colonial administration and economic exploitation. His reputation for organizational efficiency and unwavering ideological reliability marked him as a rising star within the military faction that viewed war with the Western powers as both inevitable and ultimately desirable. The China incident that erupted in 1937 revealed both Tōjō's considerable administrative capabilities and his complete indifference to Chinese suffering when it conflicted with Japanese strategic objectives. As Chief of Staff of the Kwantung Army, he helped implement comprehensive policies designed to break Chinese resistance through the systematic application of terror against civilian populations. The burning of villages suspected of harboring anti-Japanese guerrillas, the deployment of poison gas against Chinese forces, and the employment of biological weapons for field testing all proceeded under his direct supervision as routine military operations. The infamous Nanjing Massacre of 1937–38, while not directly ordered by Tōjō personally, reflected the institutional culture he had helped create and nurture within the Imperial Army. The systematic murder of Chinese prisoners of war, the mass rape of civilian women, and the competitive killing contests that Japanese officers conducted for entertainment demonstrated how completely the military had abandoned traditional concepts of honorable warfare. When disturbing reports of these atrocities reached Tokyo, Tōjō was among those who dismissed them as enemy propaganda, while privately viewing them as acceptable methods for intimidating resistance and demonstrating Japanese superiority. His appointment as army minister in 1940 placed Tōjō at the very center of Japanese war planning as the government moved inexorably toward confrontation with the United States and Britain. Unlike some military leaders who harbored private doubts about Japan's ability to defeat the Western powers in a prolonged conflict, Tōjō genuinely believed that Japanese spiritual superiority and tactical innovation could overcome American industrial advantages. His passionate advocacy for preemptive attack reflected not reckless militarism but calculated assessment that Japan's window of opportunity was rapidly closing as American rearmament accelerated. The momentous decision to attack Pearl Harbor, made during Tōjō's tenure as Prime Minister beginning in October 1941, represented the culmination of strategic thinking that had dominated Japanese military planning for nearly 2 decades. Rather than the product of a single leader's megalomania, the attack reflected institutional consensus within the military and bureaucratic establishment that war with America was preferable to accepting humiliating limits on Japanese expansion in China and Southeast Asia. Tōjō's conduct of the Pacific War revealed both his impressive administrative competence and his willingness to employ methods that violated every principle of civilized warfare when they served Japanese strategic interests. The treatment of Allied prisoners of war under his government constituted systematic barbarism disguised as military necessity. The Bataan Death March, the construction of the Burma Railway using slave labor, and the horrific medical experiments conducted by Unit 731 all proceeded with his explicit knowledge and approval as acceptable means of advancing Japanese war aims while demonstrating Asian racial hierarchies. The forced labor system that Tōjō's government implemented throughout occupied Asia represented economic exploitation on a scale that dwarfed even Nazi practices in Eastern Europe. Millions of Korean, Chinese, and Southeast Asian civilians were conscripted for construction projects, mining operations, and agricultural work, under conditions that amounted to slavery in all but name. The comfort women system that provided sexual slaves for Japanese military personnel was rationalized as necessary for maintaining troop morale and preventing the rape of local populations, though it actually institutionalized sexual violence on an unprecedented scale, while serving as another instrument of racial domination. Perhaps most revealing of Tōjō's essential character was his response to mounting evidence that Japan was inexorably losing the war against the Allied powers. Rather than seeking negotiated settlement that might preserve Japanese independence and save millions of lives, he consistently advocated for escalating resistance that would inflict maximum casualties on American forces, regardless of the catastrophic cost to Japanese civilians. The kamikaze attacks that began in 1944 reflected his fanatical conviction that spiritual dedication could compensate for material weakness, while his detailed plans for defending the home islands assumed that civilian casualties in the millions were acceptable prices for preserving national honor and racial purity. The ideology of concatenational essence that Tōjō promoted relentlessly throughout his tenure as prime minister combined emperor worship with racial supremacism in ways that made rational evaluation of military prospects virtually impossible. Japanese soldiers and civilians were systematically taught that death in service to the emperor was the highest form of human achievement, while surrender or capture represented spiritual pollution that dishonored not just the individual but his entire family lineage through multiple generations. This worldview made conventional diplomatic resolution of the conflict impossible, as any compromise would represent betrayal of sacred obligations to the divine emperor and the Japanese race. Tōjō's personal involvement in atrocity planning extended far beyond general policy approval to encompass detailed oversight of specific operations designed to terrorize and eliminate enemy populations. His authorization of biological warfare experiments on prisoners of war, his approval of medical testing that used captured Allied personnel as guinea pigs, and his endorsement of starvation policies designed to eliminate useless mouths among civilian populations demonstrated a bureaucratic approach to mass murder that rivaled Nazi efficiency while maintaining the facade of military necessity. The industrial scale of Japanese atrocities under Tōjō's leadership was perhaps most visible in China, where his government's 3-all policy kill all, burn all, loot all was implemented against rural populations suspected of supporting communist guerrillas. Entire counties were systematically depopulated, with villages burned to ash and their inhabitants murdered or enslaved according to carefully planned quotas. Conservative estimates suggest that Japanese occupation policies resulted in the deaths of 15–20 million Chinese civilians, making Tōjō's government responsible for one of history's largest genocides, though one that received less international attention than European atrocities. Yet even as Japan's military position became hopeless following the loss of key Pacific islands and the destruction of the combined fleet, Tōjō continued to advocate for escalating resistance that would transform inevitable defeat into a form of spiritual victory that would preserve Japanese racial honor for future generations. His plans for Operation Ketsugo, the defense of the Japanese home islands, assumed that civilian casualties approaching 20 million were acceptable if they demonstrated Japanese determination to fight to the death rather than accept foreign occupation and racial contamination. The atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, followed by Soviet entry into the war, and the rapid collapse of Japanese forces in Manchuria, finally convinced Emperor Hirohito to surrender despite Tōjō's passionate objections. Even then, Tōjō advocated for continuing resistance from Manchuria and argued that capitulation would dishonor the sacrifices of all who had died for the emperor. His attempted suicide following Japan's surrender was both personal acknowledgement of failure and final gesture of defiance against the occupation forces he had spent 4 years trying to destroy. Tōjō's trial before the International Military Tribunal for the Far East revealed the extent to which he had internalized the nationalist ideology that justified Japanese aggression as defensive necessity and Asian liberation from Western imperialism. His testimony showed no recognition that Chinese, Korean, or Southeast Asian peoples possessed legitimate rights to self-determination, and he consistently portrayed Japanese expansion as beneficial to the conquered populations, despite overwhelming evidence of systematic exploitation and murder on an unprecedented scale. The execution that ended Tōjō's life in December 1948 was swift and clinical, providing stark contrast to the prolonged suffering he had inflicted on millions of victims throughout Asia. His final statement expressed regret not for the immense suffering caused by Japanese policies, but for Japan's failure to achieve its righteous objectives in liberating Asia from Western imperialism. Even facing death, he remained convinced that Japan's cause had been just and that history would eventually vindicate his actions and sacrifices. The controversial legacy of Tōjō in post-war Japan reflects broader ambivalence about the Pacific War and its meaning for Japanese national identity. While officially condemned as a war criminal by the government, he is honored at Yasukuni Shrine alongside other war dead, creating ongoing diplomatic tensions with China and Korea. Some Japanese nationalists continue to view him as a patriot who sacrificed himself for his country, while others recognize him as the architect of policies that brought devastation to Japan and its Asian neighbors. The institutional continuities between Tōjō's wartime government and post-war Japanese bureaucracy have made honest reckoning with wartime atrocities politically difficult for successive Japanese administrations. Many of the administrators who implemented forced labor programs, comfort women recruitment, and biological warfare experiments continued their careers after 1945, creating vested interests in minimizing the scope and severity of wartime crimes. The result has been decades of historical revisionism that portrays Japan as victim rather than perpetrator of wartime violence. Tōjō's historical significance extends beyond the specific crimes of his government to encompass broader questions about how modern states can mobilize entire populations for criminal enterprises through ideological manipulation and institutional pressure. His success in convincing millions of Japanese that aggression was defense, that conquest was liberation, and that atrocity was duty demonstrated the power of nationalist ideology to override moral constraints and rational calculation when combined with effective propaganda and systematic indoctrination. In the end, Japan's executioner had demonstrated how traditional concepts of honor and sacrifice could be perverted into justifications for unlimited brutality when filtered through racial ideology and imperial ambition. His career proved that civilized societies could choose barbarism when presented with sufficiently compelling narratives about historical destiny and racial superiority, and that bureaucratic efficiency could be applied to mass murder as easily as to more benevolent administrative tasks. The bespectacled general had led his nation to catastrophic defeat while convincing himself that he was serving the highest principles of loyalty and patriotism. His legacy served as a permanent reminder that the greatest crimes in human history are often committed by those who believe most fervently in the righteousness of their cause and the absolute necessity of their methods, regardless of their human cost. Joseph Stalin, the man of steel and fear. In the vast expanse of the Soviet Union, where the aurora borealis danced over frozen wastelands that stretched from the Baltic to the Pacific, one man's paranoid vision would reshape the lives of 300 million people and cast a shadow of terror that reached into every village, every family, every human heart within his domain. Iosif Vissarionovich Djugashvili, who took the revolutionary name Stalin Man of Steel, would prove that ideology could be as deadly as any weapon, that political theory could justify any atrocity, and that the promise of earthly paradise could pave the road to industrialized hell. Born in 1000, 878 in the Georgian town of Gori, young Iosif seemed destined for obscurity as the son of a cobbler in a backward province of the crumbling Russian Empire. His father, Bessarion, was a drunk who beat his wife and child before abandoning them entirely, while his mother, Keke, scraped together enough money to send her brilliant son to seminary school in the hope that he might escape poverty through the Orthodox priesthood. But the theological education that was meant to save his soul instead opened his mind to revolutionary ideas that would eventually cost millions of lives. The seminary in Tiflis, where Stalin studied, was a hotbed of Georgian nationalism and socialist ideology, where students secretly read banned books and organized underground discussion groups that dissected the works of Marx and Lenin. Young Stalin excelled at his studies while simultaneously developing the conspiratorial skills that would serve him well in later political struggles. His expulsion from the seminary in 1899 for revolutionary activities marked the beginning of a career dedicated to overthrowing the existing order through any means necessary. The next 2 decades of Stalin's life were spent in the underground world of revolutionary politics, where he learned the arts of bank robbery, assassination, and organizational manipulation that would later characterize his approach to governance. Unlike Lenin and other intellectual leaders of the Bolshevik movement, Stalin was a practical revolutionary who understood that power flowed from control of resources and personnel rather than from theoretical purity or ideological consistency. His role in organizing bank robberies to fund Bolshevik activities revealed both his ruthless efficiency and his willingness to employ criminal methods for political ends. The 1907 robbery in Tiflis that netted the party 250 rubles also killed dozens of innocent bystanders, but Stalin viewed such casualties as acceptable costs of revolutionary warfare. This casual attitude toward human life would later manifest itself in policies that treated entire populations as expendable resources in the service of socialist construction. The October Revolution of 1917 found Stalin in a relatively minor position within the Bolshevik hierarchy, but his administrative skills and political cunning quickly brought him to Lenin's attention. His appointment as Commissar of Nationalities reflected both his Georgian origins and his understanding of how ethnic divisions could be exploited for political advantage. The brutal policies he implemented during the Russian Civil War, including the execution of captured officers and the systematic looting of churches, demonstrated his willingness to use terror as a routine instrument of governance. Lenin's death in 1924 created a succession crisis that Stalin navigated with Machiavellian skill, playing rivals against each other while gradually accumulating the institutional power necessary to eliminate all opposition. His defeat of Trotsky, Bukharin, and other contenders was achieved not through dramatic confrontations but through patient manipulation of party bureaucracy and careful cultivation of loyal supporters in key positions. By the late 1920s, he had achieved what no previous revolutionary leader had managed: absolute personal control over a major modern state. The collectivization of agriculture that began in 1929 revealed the true character of Stalin's socialism and his attitude toward the human costs of rapid modernization. Rather than the gradual transition envisioned by earlier Marxist theorists, Stalin imposed collective farming through methods that amounted to a declaration of war against the peasantry that comprised 80% of the Soviet population. The kulaks, relatively prosperous farmers who were deemed class enemies, faced deportation, imprisonment, or execution, while their property was seized to fund industrial development. The resistance that collectivization encountered in Ukraine and other grain-producing regions was met with policies deliberately designed to create famine conditions that would break peasant opposition once and for all. The Holodomor of 1932-33 was not a natural disaster, but a man-made catastrophe that resulted from Stalin's decision to confiscate grain reserves, ban population movement, and prohibit private food sales while continuing to export grain to foreign markets to finance industrial projects. The death toll from collectivization and its associated famines reached into the millions, with some estimates suggesting that 7–10 million people died directly from starvation, while millions more perished in the deportations and executions that accompanied the campaign. Yet Stalin viewed these casualties not as tragic consequences of mistaken policies, but as necessary sacrifices for the greater good of socialist construction. The transformation of Soviet agriculture from private to collective ownership had been achieved, and the human cost was irrelevant compared to this ideological victory. The industrial transformation that accompanied agricultural collectivization was achieved through methods that rivaled pharaonic Egypt in their disregard for human welfare. The construction of canals, dams, and factories was accomplished largely through forced labor provided by the growing population of political prisoners held in the expanding network of camps that would become known as the Gulag. These facilities served multiple purposes. They removed potential opponents from society, provided cheap labor for construction projects, and demonstrated the fate awaiting anyone who questioned party policies. The Great Purge of 1936–38 represented the climax of Stalin's paranoid vision and his understanding that terror could serve as both weapon and shield for an embattled regime. Unlike earlier persecutions that had targeted specific groups like kulaks or former officials, the purge was designed to eliminate any individual who might potentially threaten Stalin's authority, regardless of their loyalty or revolutionary credentials. Old Bolsheviks who had made the revolution were tortured into confessing imaginary crimes, while military officers who had built the Red Army were executed as foreign agents. The show trials that provided public justification for the purge were theatrical masterpieces of totalitarian propaganda, combining genuine confessions extracted through torture with elaborate conspiracy theories that explained all of the Soviet Union's problems as products of sabotage by hidden enemies. The defendants, broken by months of interrogation and threats against their families, recited their assigned roles with the mechanical precision of actors who knew that any deviation from the script would result in even worse consequences for their loved ones. Perhaps most chilling was the enthusiastic participation of ordinary Soviet citizens in the purge, as neighbors denounced neighbors and children informed on parents in an atmosphere of collective paranoia that made everyone both potential victim and potential perpetrator. The NKVD received millions of denunciations from citizens eager to prove their loyalty or settle personal grudges, creating a surveillance state where survival depended on demonstrating zealous support for policies that everyone privately feared. The military purge that eliminated most of the Red Army's experienced officer corps would prove catastrophic when Germany invaded in 1941, but Stalin viewed the temporary weakening of Soviet defenses as acceptable compared to the permanent threat posed by potentially disloyal generals. His calculation that political reliability was more important than military competence reflected a worldview where ideological purity trumped practical considerations, even when national survival was at stake. World War II provided Stalin with the opportunity to present himself as the savior of the Soviet people rather than their oppressor, but his conduct of the war revealed the same indifference to human suffering that had characterized his peacetime policies. The not one step back order of 1942 established blocking detachments behind Soviet lines with orders to shoot anyone who retreated without authorization, while Order 227 made surrender a capital offense punishable by execution of the soldiers' family members. The siege of Leningrad, which lasted 872 days, and claimed over 1 million civilian lives, continued partly because Stalin refused to allow evacuation of the city's population. His reasoning was both strategic and ideological. A city defended by its own residents would fight more desperately than one defended only by soldiers, while the suffering of Leningraders would serve as propaganda ammunition against the Nazi invaders. The fact that children were dying of starvation was less important than the political value of their sacrifice. Soviet victory in World War II enhanced Stalin's prestige both domestically and internationally, but it also created new opportunities for persecution as millions of Soviet citizens who had been exposed to foreign influences were deemed security risks requiring re-education or elimination. Prisoners of war who survived Nazi captivity were often sent directly to Gulag camps, on the assumption that anyone who had not died fighting must have collaborated with the enemy. Entire ethnic groups were deported from their ancestral lands on suspicion of collective disloyalty, with the Crimean Tatars, Chechens, and Ingush among the peoples who were loaded into cattle cars and shipped to Central Asia with minimal provisions. The expansion of Soviet influence into Eastern Europe after 1945 provided Stalin with new territories to reorganize according to his vision of socialist society. The satellite states established in Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, and elsewhere served as laboratories for testing methods of social control that had been perfected within the Soviet Union. Local communist parties, purged of unreliable elements and staffed with Soviet-trained personnel, implemented collectivization, industrialization, and terror campaigns that replicated the Soviet model with mechanical precision. The paranoia that had always characterized Stalin's worldview intensified during his final years as he became convinced that enemies were multiplying both within the Soviet Union and throughout the international communist movement. The Doctor's Plot of 1952-53, which accused Jewish physicians of plotting to assassinate Soviet leaders, appeared to be the prelude to another massive purge that would have dwarfed even the terror of the 1930s. Only Stalin's death in March 1953 prevented the implementation of policies that might have resulted in the deportation or execution of the entire Soviet Jewish population. The circumstances surrounding Stalin's death remain mysterious, with some evidence suggesting that his inner circle may have accelerated his demise to prevent another round of purges that would have claimed many of them as victims. His final hours, spent lying paralyzed on the floor of his dacha while terrified subordinates debated whether to summon medical help, provided a fitting end to a career built on the systematic cultivation of fear and suspicion. The immediate aftermath of Stalin's death revealed both the extent of his personal control over the Soviet system and the institutional weakness of a state built around one man's paranoid vision. His successors spent years gradually dismantling the most oppressive aspects of Stalinist rule while struggling to maintain the legitimacy of a system that had been defined by terror and coercion. The process of de-Stalinization that began under Khrushchev represented an implicit admission that the policies of the previous 3 decades had been both criminal and counterproductive. Yet Stalin's influence on Soviet society and international communism extended far beyond his personal lifespan. The institutional structures he created, the centralized planning system, the secret police apparatus, the cult of personality surrounding the supreme leader-provided templates that were copied by communist movements throughout the world. Mao Zedong, Pol Pot, and countless other revolutionary leaders studied Stalin's methods and adapted them to local conditions, spreading variations of Stalinist terror to every continent. The human cost of Stalin's rule remains difficult to calculate precisely, but conservative estimates suggest that his policies were directly responsible for the deaths of 20–25 million Soviet citizens, while broader estimates that include war casualties and demographic losses reach as high as 40 million. These numbers represent not just statistical abstractions but individual human beings whose lives were cut short by policies implemented with bureaucratic efficiency and ideological certainty. Perhaps Stalin's most lasting achievement was demonstrating how completely traditional moral constraints could be overridden when filtered through totalitarian ideology and institutional structures. The peasants who starved during collectivization, the officials who confessed to imaginary crimes during show trials, and the soldiers who died in human wave attacks were all sacrificed to abstract principles that justified any means necessary to achieve predetermined ends. The Man of Steel had forged the Soviet Union into a nuclear superpower capable of competing with the United States on the global stage, but the methods he used to achieve this transformation had scarred Soviet society in ways that would contribute to the system's eventual collapse. His reign had proven that socialism could indeed be built in one country, but only at a human cost that called into question whether the result deserved to be called civilization at all. In the end, Stalin's legacy was written in the frozen soil of Siberian camps, the mass graves of executed peasants, and the traumatized psyche of survivors who had learned to fear their own government more than any foreign enemy. The steel in his name had been forged from human suffering on an industrial scale, creating a monument to political ideology's capacity for evil that would endure long after his empire had crumbled into dust. Mao Zedong, the chairman of chaos. In the ancient land of China, where dynasties had risen and fallen for millennia, while peasants tended the same fields their ancestors had worked since the time of Confucius, one man would unleash forces of destruction that dwarfed the brutalities of barbarian invasions and natural disasters combined. Mao Zedong, the chairman who commanded a nation of nearly 1 billion people, transformed Marxist-Leninist ideology into an instrument of chaos that would claim more lives than any war, plague, or famine in recorded history, all while presenting himself as the great liberator of the Chinese people. Born in 1893 in the village of Shaoshan in Hunan province, young Mao seemed destined for the life of a prosperous peasant in a China that remained trapped between ancient traditions and the humiliating pressure of foreign powers. His father was a relatively successful farmer and grain dealer who embodied the traditional Confucian values of hard work, frugality, and respect for authority, while his mother provided the gentler influence that would later manifest in Mao's lifelong ability to inspire devoted loyalty among his followers. The China of Mao's youth was a nation in crisis, torn between the competing demands of tradition and modernity, while foreign powers carved out spheres of influence that reduced the ancient Middle Kingdom to semi-colonial status. The Qing dynasty that had ruled for nearly 3 centuries was crumbling under the weight of internal rebellion and external pressure, while intellectuals and revolutionaries searched desperately for formulas that might restore Chinese power and dignity. Mao's education reflected this tension between old and new, as he studied classical Chinese literature while absorbing radical Western ideas about democracy, nationalism, and social revolution. His experiences as a student in Changsha exposed him to the new culture movement that sought to modernize Chinese society through the wholesale rejection of traditional values, while his work as a library assistant at Beijing University brought him into contact with the Marxist study groups that would shape his political development. The May 4th movement of 1919, sparked by popular outrage over the Paris Peace Conference's decision to award German concessions in China to Japan, provided Mao with his first taste of mass political mobilization and the intoxicating power of popular anger directed against foreign oppression and domestic weakness. His participation in student demonstrations and his early writings revealed a mind that instinctively grasped the revolutionary potential of Chinese nationalism when properly organized and directed. The Chinese Communist Party that Mao joined in 1921 was a tiny organization of intellectuals and students who possessed more enthusiasm than practical experience. But the Soviet advisors who provided funding and guidance brought with them the organizational methods and ideological framework that would eventually transform this marginal group into the masters of the world's most populous nation. Mao's genius lay in recognizing that Marxist revolution in China would have to be built on peasant grievances rather than industrial worker consciousness, adapting European socialist theory to Chinese agricultural reality. The Long March of 1934–35, which saw the communist forces retreat over 60 miles to escape nationalist encirclement, provided Mao with the opportunity to consolidate his leadership of the party while creating the heroic mythology that would sustain communist morale through decades of subsequent struggle. The march was less a strategic withdrawal than a desperate flight from annihilation, but Mao's propaganda transformed military defeat into spiritual victory, creating a narrative of communist perseverance that justified any sacrifice in service of the revolutionary cause. The war against Japan that began in 1937 allowed Mao to present the Communist Party as the authentic voice of Chinese resistance, while positioning himself as the inevitable leader of post-war China. His strategy of rural base areas and guerrilla warfare proved remarkably effective against Japanese occupation forces, but it also provided cover for the elimination of rival communist leaders and the gradual transformation of the party into an instrument of Mao's personal will. The rectification campaigns that Mao conducted within communist-controlled areas during the 940s established the pattern of ideological purification and violent political theatre that would characterize his later rule over all of China. These campaigns combined genuine political education with systematic psychological torture designed to break individual will and create absolute conformity to the party line as interpreted by Mao himself. The techniques developed during this period, public confession sessions, mutual denunciation meetings, and the use of social pressure to enforce political orthodoxy, would later be applied to the entire Chinese population. Victory in the Chinese Civil War in 1949 presented Mao with the opportunity to implement his vision of socialist transformation on a scale unprecedented in human history. The People's Republic of China that emerged from communist victory controlled a territory larger than Europe and North America combined, inhabited by nearly a quarter of the world's population, most of whom remained trapped in poverty that had characterized Chinese rural life for centuries. The land reform campaigns that began in 1950 revealed both Mao's understanding of peasant grievances and his willingness to employ mass violence as an instrument of social change. Rather than simply redistributing land from landlords to tenants through administrative decree, the communist government organized speak bitterness meetings where peasants were encouraged to publicly accuse their former landlords of exploitation and abuse before executing them in front of crowds that included their own families and neighbors. These ritualized killings served multiple purposes beyond mere land redistribution. They implicated millions of peasants in the destruction of the old order, making them stakeholders in the success of the new regime. They eliminated potential leaders of rural resistance, and they demonstrated the communist government's commitment to revolutionary transformation regardless of human cost. Conservative estimates suggest that 1–2 million landlords died during land reform, though Mao himself later claimed that 800 enemies of the people had been executed, a figure he presented as evidence of the revolution's thoroughness rather than its brutality. The 3 anti and 5 anti campaigns of 1951–52 extended the terror from rural areas to cities as Mao targeted corruption, waste, and bourgeois thinking among government officials and private businessmen. These campaigns combined economic reorganization with political persecution, as individuals were required to confess not just to specific crimes, but to ideological errors that demonstrated insufficient loyalty to socialist principles. The suicide rate among targeted groups reached epidemic proportions as individuals chose death over the prolonged humiliation of public denunciation and struggle sessions. But it was the Great Leap Forward of 1958–62 that revealed the full extent of Mao's capacity for mass destruction through ideological fanaticism disguised as economic policy. Convinced that China could surpass Britain in steel production within 15 years through the mobilization of popular enthusiasm, Mao launched a campaign that combined wildly unrealistic production targets with pseudoscientific agricultural techniques that would have been laughable if their consequences had not been so catastrophic. The backyard furnaces that were constructed throughout China to meet impossible steel production quotas consumed agricultural tools and household items while producing unusable pig iron, destroying the implements necessary for farming, while contributing nothing to actual industrial development. Meanwhile, agricultural communes were ordered to plant crops according to theories that defied basic botanical knowledge, resulting in massive crop failures that were compounded by the diversion of agricultural labor to useless industrial projects. The famine that resulted from these policies was not a natural disaster, but a man-made catastrophe that claimed an estimated 30–45 million lives, making it the deadliest famine in human history. Yet local officials, terrified of contradicting Mao's optimistic projections, continued to report record harvests, even as peasants died of starvation in the fields around them. Grain was exported to the Soviet Union to pay for industrial equipment, while Chinese citizens resorted to eating bark, grass, and eventually each other in desperate attempts to survive. Mao's response to mounting evidence of catastrophe revealed the depths of his ideological fanaticism and his complete indifference to human suffering when it conflicted with his political objectives. Rather than acknowledging the failure of his policies, he blamed saboteurs, rightists, and insufficient revolutionary enthusiasm for problems that were obviously the result of his own directives. When confronted with reports of mass starvation, he allegedly responded that deaths were inevitable in any revolutionary transformation and that the sacrifice of a generation was acceptable if it advanced the cause of socialism. The Cultural Revolution that Mao launched in 1966 represented the culmination of his vision and his determination to prevent the emergence of a new privileged class that might threaten his radical agenda. Ostensibly directed against capitalist roaders within the Communist Party itself, the campaign quickly expanded into a systematic assault on Chinese civilization that targeted intellectuals, artists, religious practitioners, and anyone associated with traditional culture or foreign influence. The Red Guard's Steenage fanatics, armed with copies of Mao's Little Red Book and unlimited license to attack authority figures, became the instruments of cultural vandalism that destroyed temples, libraries, and museums while subjecting millions of Chinese to public humiliation and physical violence. Teachers were beaten by their own students, parents were denounced by their children, and entire categories of people were reclassified as enemies of the people based on their family background, education, or previous political associations. The struggle sessions that became the dominant form of political theatre during the Cultural Revolution combined elements of religious revival meeting, public trial, and mob violence in spectacles designed to break individual will while demonstrating the unlimited power of the masses as directed by Mao's thought. Victims were forced to wear dunce caps and placards describing their crimes, made to kneel for hours while crowds shouted accusations, and beaten to death if their confessions were deemed insufficiently sincere. Perhaps most disturbing was the enthusiasm with which millions of Chinese participated in these rituals of destruction. As neighbors turned against neighbors and family members informed on each other in an atmosphere of collective hysteria that made survival dependent on demonstrating zealous support for policies that everyone privately recognized as insane. The Cultural Revolution revealed how completely traditional social bonds could be dissolved when replaced by ideological loyalty, and how easily civilized people could be transformed into instruments of systematic cruelty. The economic devastation caused by the Cultural Revolution was almost as severe as its cultural destruction. As schools and universities were closed, industrial production was disrupted by political campaigns, and agricultural output declined due to the persecution of experienced farmers and agronomists. China's development was set back by decades as technical expertise was subordinated to political orthodoxy and international isolation was embraced as proof of revolutionary purity. Yet even as China descended into chaos, Mao's international prestige reached new heights as revolutionary movements throughout the Third World adopted his model of peasant-based insurgency and cultural transformation. The Little Red Book became one of the most widely distributed publications in human history, while Maoist parties emerged in countries as diverse as Peru, Nepal, and the Philippines, spreading variations of Chinese revolutionary practice to every continent. The final phase of Mao's rule, from 1970 until his death in 1976, was marked by the gradual recognition that his radical policies had failed catastrophically and the quiet reversal of many Cultural Revolution excesses. The rapprochement with the United States that culminated in Nixon's 1972 visit to Beijing represented a fundamental shift in Chinese foreign policy that contradicted decades of anti-imperialist rhetoric, while the rehabilitation of purged officials like Deng Xiaoping signaled the beginning of a more pragmatic approach to economic development. When Mao finally died in September 1976, his passing marked the end of an era that had transformed China beyond recognition, while claiming more lives than any conflict in human history. The immediate aftermath of his death saw the arrest of the Gang of Four He's closest radical allies and the beginning of a systematic dismantling of his legacy that would continue for decades. Yet the institutional structures he had created, particularly the Communist Party's monopoly on political power, would survive his death, and provide the framework for China's subsequent economic transformation. The official Chinese assessment of Mao's legacy 70% correct. 30% mistaken represents a politically convenient formula that allows the Communist Party to maintain legitimacy while distancing itself from his worst excesses. But this calculation ignores the human cost of policies that treated individual lives as expendable resources in service of abstract ideological goals and historical processes that brooked no opposition or delay. Conservative estimates of the deaths caused by Mao's policies range from 65–80 million people, making him responsible for more deaths than Hitler and Stalin combined. These figures include not just the dramatic casualties of the Great Leap Forward and Cultural Revolution, but also the quieter victims of land reform, political campaigns, and the systematic persecution of anyone deemed an enemy of the people. The psychological damage inflicted on Chinese society, the destruction of trust between family members, the elimination of independent institutions, the cultivation of fear and conformity as survival strategies proved even more lasting than the physical destruction. Yet Mao's influence extended far beyond China's borders to encompass revolutionary movements that adopted his model of peasant mobilization and cultural transformation. From the Khmer Rouge in Cambodia to the Shining Path in Peru, Maoist movements applied his techniques of social control and ideological purification, with results that were consistently catastrophic for the populations they claimed to liberate. The chairman of chaos had succeeded in transforming China from a weak, divided nation into a unified socialist state capable of competing with the superpowers, but the methods he used to achieve this transformation had scarred Chinese civilization in ways that would take generations to heal. His reign demonstrated that revolutionary ideology could justify any atrocity when combined with sufficient organizational skill and popular desperation. In the end, Mao's greatest achievement was also his greatest crime. He had shown how completely human society could be reshaped through the systematic application of violence and ideological pressure. The peasant revolutionary who had promised to liberate the Chinese people had instead subjected them to forms of tyranny that surpassed anything in their long and often brutal history, proving that the greatest oppression often comes from those who claim to be fighting for liberation. The great helmsman had steered his ship of state through treacherous waters, but the navigation had cost more lives than any storm or shipwreck in human memory, leaving behind a legacy written in the bones of millions who had trusted him to lead them to a better world. Kim Il-sung, eternal president of repression. In the mountainous peninsula of Korea, where ancient kingdoms had survived for millennia through the careful balance of accommodating stronger neighbors while preserving their essential independence, one man would create a state so thoroughly isolated from the outside world that it became a hermit kingdom beyond the wildest dreams of traditional Korean rulers. Kim Il-sung, the guerrilla fighter who became North Korea's great leader, established a dynasty that combined the worst features of medieval absolutism with modern totalitarian control, creating a system of repression so complete that it persisted long after his death and became the template for hereditary communist dictatorship. Born Kim Sung-ju in 1912 in a Korea already under Japanese colonial rule, the future great leader came of age during a period when Korean independence seemed like an impossible dream, and collaboration with foreign occupiers appeared to be the only realistic path to personal advancement. His father was a traditional Korean scholar who had been reduced to teaching at a Christian mission school, while his mother provided the strong moral foundation that would later be mythologized in North Korean propaganda as the source of Kim's supposedly supernatural leadership abilities. The Japanese occupation that defined Kim's youth was characterized by systematic cultural suppression, designed to eliminate Korean identity entirely and transform the peninsula's inhabitants into loyal subjects of the Japanese Empire. Korean language was banned in schools, traditional names were replaced with Japanese equivalents, and young Koreans were conscripted for forced labor in Japanese war industries. This experience of occupation and cultural genocide would profoundly shape Kim's worldview and his later approach to building a Korean state that would never again be vulnerable to foreign domination. Kim's entry into anti-Japanese resistance came through his family's migration to Manchuria, where Korean exile communities had established bases for guerrilla operations against Japanese forces. The resistance movement in which young Kim participated was fragmented and often ineffective, but it provided him with military experience and revolutionary credentials that would prove crucial in his later rise to power. His adoption of the nom de guerre Kim Il-sung linked him to an earlier Korean resistance hero, allowing him to claim a heroic legacy that his actual military record could not support. The guerrilla warfare that Kim conducted against Japanese forces in the 1930s was largely ineffective in military terms, but it established his reputation as one of the few Korean leaders who had actively fought against the occupation rather than accommodating it. This reputation for resistance, combined with his connections to Soviet military advisors, positioned him as the logical choice to lead a communist government in northern Korea when the peninsula was divided following Japan's defeat in 1945. The Soviet occupation of northern Korea provided Kim with the opportunity to eliminate rivals and consolidate power while claiming to represent authentic Korean nationalism rather than foreign communist ideology. Unlike the American-backed government in the South, which included many officials who had collaborated with Japanese colonial administration, Kim's regime could present itself as the true heir to Korean independence movements and the only legitimate government on the peninsula. The land reform that Kim implemented in northern Korea during the late 1940s followed the pattern established by communist movements throughout Asia, but it was adapted to specifically Korean conditions and grievances. The elimination of landlord classes and the redistribution of agricultural land to peasant farmers addressed genuine popular grievances, while also serving the political purpose of creating a new class of small farmers whose continued prosperity depended on the survival of the communist regime. The Korean War that began in 1950 represented Kim's attempt to unify the peninsula under communist rule, but it also revealed his willingness to sacrifice Korean lives on a massive scale to achieve political objectives. His decision to invade South Korea, made with Stalin's support but against Chinese advice, triggered a conflict that would claim millions of Korean lives while leaving the peninsula permanently divided. The human cost of Kim's miscalculation was staggering. An estimated 2-3 million Korean civilians died during the war, along with hundreds of thousands of military casualties on both sides. Kim's conduct during the war demonstrated both his strategic limitations and his complete indifference to civilian suffering when it conflicted with military necessity. The systematic destruction of South Korean cities, the execution of political prisoners, and the use of human shields during retreat operations all proceeded under his direct orders as acceptable methods of revolutionary warfare. When Chinese intervention saved his regime from complete defeat, Kim presented this foreign rescue as vindication of his strategic vision rather than acknowledgement of his fundamental miscalculation. The post-war reconstruction of North Korea provided Kim with the opportunity to implement his vision of socialist development while eliminating any remaining sources of opposition to his personal rule. The Songbun system that he established classified every North Korean citizen according to their family's political reliability, creating a rigid caste system that determined access to education, employment, housing, and food distribution. This system of hereditary political classification ensured that loyalty to the regime became a multi-generational obligation that could never be escaped through individual achievement or political conversion. The personality cult that grew around Kim Il-sung during the 1960s exceeded even Stalin's megalomania in its systematic deification of a living ruler. North Korean propaganda presented Kim as a military genius who had single-handedly defeated Japanese imperialism, a political theorist whose ideas surpassed Marx and Lenin in their revolutionary insight, and a paternal figure whose love for the Korean people justified absolute obedience to his will. The great leader became not just a political title but a religious designation that placed Kim beyond criticism or rational evaluation. The Duce ideology that Kim developed as North Korea's guiding philosophy combined traditional Korean concepts of self-reliance with Marxist-Leninist political theory and Confucian ideas about hierarchical social organization. This supposedly original theoretical contribution to communist thought was actually a clever adaptation of existing ideas that provided ideological justification for policies that might otherwise seem like betrayals of socialist internationalism. The emphasis on Korean uniqueness and self-reliance allowed Kim to pursue nationalist policies while maintaining the fiction of revolutionary solidarity with other communist movements. The economic development strategy that North Korea pursued under Kim's leadership achieved remarkable results during the 1950s and 1960s as the country rebuilt from wartime devastation while establishing heavy industry and modern infrastructure. The command economy that Kim constructed was able to mobilize resources efficiently for specific projects, and the absence of market mechanisms eliminated the unemployment and inequality that plagued capitalist economies during the same period. For a time, North Korea's economic performance compared favorably with South Korea's, suggesting that Kim's model of development might indeed represent a viable alternative to capitalist modernization. But the political costs of this economic development were enormous, as Kim systematically eliminated any institution or individual that might provide alternative sources of authority or legitimacy. The Workers' Party, the military, the bureaucracy, and even his own family were subjected to periodic purges designed to prevent the emergence of potential rivals. The prison camp system that Kim established to house political prisoners and their families created a hidden archipelago of suffering that held an estimated 150,000 people at any given time. The Kwanliso camps that formed the backbone of North Korea's repression system were designed not just to punish political crimes, but to eliminate entire family lines deemed unreliable by the regime. Children born in these camps were raised without any knowledge of the outside world, receiving education that consisted primarily of political indoctrination and training for manual labor. The three-generation rule that governed political punishment meant that the original crime could be completely forgotten, while punishment continued to be inherited by people who had played no role in the original offense. Life within North Korea under Kim Il-sung's rule was characterized by a level of social control that exceeded anything achieved by previous totalitarian systems. The Inminban neighborhood watch system ensured that every citizen was under constant surveillance by their neighbors, while the Songbun classification system made social mobility dependent on political reliability rather than individual merit. Public distribution of food, housing, and consumer goods was controlled by the state, making survival itself dependent on political conformity. The isolation that Kim imposed on North Korea was both geographic and intellectual, as citizens were forbidden from traveling abroad or accessing foreign media, while being constantly exposed to propaganda that presented the outside world as hostile and inferior to North Korean socialism. This information control was so complete that many North Koreans genuinely believed that their country was the most prosperous and advanced nation on earth, while other countries envied the Korean people's happiness under the great leader's benevolent guidance. The succession planning that occupied Kim's later years revealed his determination to transform North Korea from a communist state into a hereditary monarchy disguised as socialist democracy. The elevation of his son, Kim Jong-il, to positions of increasing responsibility during the 1970s and 1980s represented a fundamental betrayal of communist principles, but it was presented as the natural expression of the Korean people's desire to continue receiving guidance from the Kim family's revolutionary bloodline. The famines that struck North Korea during the 1990s, several years after Kim Il-sung's death, revealed the ultimate failure of his economic model and the human cost of his political priorities. The collapse of the Soviet Union had eliminated North Korea's primary source of economic support, while decades of militarization and political control had created an economy incapable of feeding its own population without foreign assistance. An estimated 601 million North Koreans died of starvation during the arduous march of the mid-1990s, while the regime continued to prioritize military spending and luxury goods for the elite over basic necessities for ordinary citizens. Yet even death could not end Kim Il-sung's hold over North Korea, as his son and grandson continued to rule in his name, while presenting themselves as merely the executors of the great leader's eternal will. The constitutional revision that declared Kim Il-sung eternal president even after his death in 1994 represented the ultimate expression of the personality cult that he had spent decades constructing. North Korea became the world's first necrocratia state, ruled by a dead man whose supposed wishes continued to guide policy long after his body had been preserved in a mausoleum for public veneration. The international legacy of Kim Il-sung's rule extended far beyond North Korea's borders to influence independence movements and authoritarian regimes throughout the developing world. His model of combining nationalist rhetoric with socialist economics, while maintaining absolute personal control, provided a template that was copied by leaders as diverse as Robert Mugabe in Zimbabwe and the Sandinistas in Nicaragua. The idea that small nations could maintain independence through isolation and ideological purity appealed to many post-colonial leaders who viewed the international system as inherently hostile to their interests. The nuclear weapons program that North Korea developed under Kim's successors represented the logical culmination of his strategy for ensuring regime survival through military deterrence. The military-first policy that prioritized defense spending over economic development reflected Kim's belief that political independence was more important than material prosperity, and that any sacrifice was justified to prevent foreign domination. This approach succeeded in preserving North Korean independence, but at the cost of turning the country into an impoverished garrison state where ordinary citizens lived in conditions that resembled medieval serfdom. The human rights abuses that characterized Kim Il-sung's rule and continued under his successors created a form of systematic oppression that rivaled anything achieved by history's most notorious dictators. The use of public executions as entertainment, the practice of punishing entire families for individual political crimes, and the establishment of prison camps, where children were born and died without ever experiencing freedom, all reflected a level of institutional cruelty that seemed designed to break the human spirit entirely. Perhaps most disturbing was the success of Kim's propaganda in convincing many North Koreans that their suffering was not only necessary but noble, that their sacrifices were advancing the cause of Korean independence and socialist development. The tears shed by citizens during Kim's funeral appeared genuine, reflecting not just fear of punishment for insufficient grief, but authentic emotional attachment to a leader who had systematically destroyed their opportunities for normal human life. The dynastic succession that Kim established represented a fundamental corruption of communist ideology, transforming a movement that had promised to eliminate class privilege into a system where political power was inherited like medieval monarchy. Yet this succession was presented as the natural expression of Korean political culture and the people's voluntary choice to continue receiving guidance from the Kim family's revolutionary bloodline. Kim Il-sung's ultimate achievement was creating a state that could survive indefinitely, regardless of its economic failure or international isolation, a political system so completely closed to outside influence that it could persist through famines, economic collapse, and the death of its founder. The great leader had succeeded in building a form of totalitarian control that was more complete and durable than anything achieved by Stalin, Hitler, or Mao, creating a prison disguised as a paradise that held an entire nation captive. The eternal president had indeed achieved a form of immortality, but it was the immortality of a nightmare that refused to end, a system of oppression so perfectly designed that it could reproduce itself indefinitely, while convincing its victims that their suffering was actually their salvation. In creating North Korea, Kim Il-sung had shown that totalitarian control could become self-perpetuating when combined with complete information control and the systematic destruction of all alternative sources of authority or legitimacy. Pol Pot, the brother number one. In the ancient kingdom of Cambodia, where the mighty temples of Angkor Wat stood as monuments to a civilization that had once dominated Southeast Asia, one man would unleash a revolution so radical that it sought to erase not just political systems but civilization itself, returning an entire nation to an agrarian paradise that existed only in the fevered imagination of urban intellectuals who had never worked a rice field in their lives. Saloth Tsar, who took the nom de guerre Pol Pot, would prove that ideology could be more destructive than any foreign invasion, that the promise of social purification could justify the elimination of entire categories of human beings, and that the pursuit of perfection could create hell on earth. Born around 1925 into a relatively prosperous peasant family in Kompong Tom province, young Saloth Tsar seemed destined for the comfortable life of a minor official in French colonial Cambodia, where traditional monarchical authority coexisted with European administrative control in the typical colonial arrangement that characterized French Indochina. His family's modest prosperity allowed him to receive an education that few rural Cambodians could afford, including several years at a Catholic school in Phnom Penh, where he was exposed to French culture and European ideas about progress and social organization. The Cambodia of Pol Pot's youth was a society caught between competing visions of modernity, as French colonial administrators promoted Western education and economic development, while King Norodom Sihanouk attempted to preserve traditional Khmer culture and political institutions. The tension between these approaches created opportunities for young Cambodians to study abroad, and Pol Pot was among the students who received scholarships to study in Paris during the early 1950s, where he would encounter the radical ideas that would shape his revolutionary worldview. The Paris of the early Cold War was a hotbed of intellectual ferment, where colonial students were exposed to Marxist theory, anti-imperialist ideology, and various forms of radical politics that promised to liberate the developing world from Western domination. Pol Pot's exposure to French Communist Party doctrine during his student years provided the theoretical framework for ideas about social transformation and revolutionary struggle, while his experiences of racism and cultural condescension in Paris reinforced his determination to create a Cambodia that would be completely independent of foreign influence. The Khmer Rouge movement that Pol Pot helped create during the 1960s was initially a minor faction within the broader communist insurgency that was spreading throughout Indochina, but it distinguished itself through the radical nature of its ideology and its complete rejection of compromise with existing political institutions. Unlike the Vietnamese communists who sought to modernize their society through socialist development, the Khmer Rouge envisioned a return to an idealized agrarian past that had supposedly existed before foreign contamination had corrupted Khmer civilization. The American bombing of Cambodia during the Vietnam War provided the Khmer Rouge with both the popular grievances and the military opportunity necessary to transform themselves from a marginal insurgency into a serious contender for power. The destruction caused by American B-52 raids, which dropped more bombs on neutral Cambodia than had been used in all of World War II, created hundreds of thousands of refugees who provided the Khmer Rouge with recruits for their revolutionary army. More importantly, the bombing campaigns convinced many Cambodians that traditional political solutions were inadequate to address the scale of foreign intervention in their country. Pol Pot's rise to leadership within the Khmer Rouge reflected both his ideological commitment and his skill at eliminating rivals through methods that foreshadowed the brutality of his later rule. The disappearance of potential competitors and the systematic purging of party members suspected of insufficient revolutionary fervor created an organization that was completely subordinated to Pol Pot's vision and willing to implement policies that more pragmatic leaders might have questioned or modified. The capture of Phnom Penh in April 1975 marked the beginning of one of history's most radical social experiments, as the Khmer Rouge immediately began implementing policies designed to transform Cambodia into a pure agrarian socialist state within a single generation. The forced evacuation of cities, the elimination of money, the abolition of private property, and the separation of families were presented as necessary steps in the creation of a new society that would surpass all previous civilizations in its equality and self-sufficiency. The evacuation of Phnom Penh, which forced nearly 2 million people to march into the countryside at gunpoint, revealed both the scope of Khmer Rouge ambitions and the human cost of their revolutionary program. City dwellers were classified as new people whose bourgeois background made them inherently suspect, while rural peasants were designated as base people, whose supposedly pure class consciousness qualified them to lead the revolutionary transformation. This crude distinction ignored the complex realities of Cambodian society while providing ideological justification for policies that treated urban education and experience as evidence of political unreliability. The agricultural communes that the Khmer Rouge established throughout Cambodia were designed to maximize production while minimizing individual autonomy, creating a form of collective organization that resembled nothing so much as vast outdoor prisons where inmates were forced to work until they collapsed from exhaustion or starvation. The rejection of modern agricultural techniques in favor of primitive methods that supposedly embodied authentic Khmer tradition resulted in massive crop failures that were blamed on sabotage by class enemies rather than acknowledged as consequences of misguided policies. Children became particular targets for Khmer Rouge recruitment and indoctrination, as the movement recognized that young people could be more easily molded into perfect revolutionary instruments than adults who retained memories of pre-revolutionary life. The child soldiers who enforced Khmer Rouge policies were often more brutal than their adult commanders, having been systematically taught that compassion was weakness and that revolutionary purity required the elimination of all vestiges of the old society, including their own families when necessary. The concept of Year Zero that guided Khmer Rouge policies represented perhaps the most radical attempt at social engineering in human history, as the movement sought to eliminate not just existing political and economic institutions but the entire cultural inheritance of Cambodian civilization. Schools were closed, libraries burned, temples demolished, and intellectuals murdered in an effort to create a completely new society that would be free from the contamination of previous historical development. The S-21 prison in Phnom Penh became the symbol of Khmer Rouge brutality, as thousands of suspected enemies were tortured into confessing imaginary crimes before being executed in methods designed to maximize suffering while minimizing the cost of ammunition. The detailed records kept by prison administrators revealed a bureaucratic approach to mass murder that rivaled Nazi efficiency, while the forced confessions extracted from victims created elaborate conspiracy theories that justified increasingly paranoid searches for hidden enemies. The killing fields that surrounded Phnom Penh and other major population centers became monuments to the Khmer Rouge vision of social purification, as hundreds of thousands of Cambodians were executed for crimes that ranged from speaking foreign languages to wearing glasses that suggested intellectual pretensions. The methods of execution were deliberately primitive clubs, hoes, and sharpened bamboo stakes rather than bullets, reflecting both the movement's rejection of modern technology and its calculation that psychological terror was more effective than simple killing in maintaining social control. The targeting of ethnic minorities revealed the racist undercurrents that ran beneath Khmer Rouge ideology, as Vietnamese, Chinese, and Cham populations were subjected to genocidal policies that aimed at their complete elimination from Cambodian territory. The Vietnamese minority, in particular, was viewed as inherently treacherous due to their supposed loyalty to Vietnam's communist government, while Chinese merchants were eliminated as representatives of capitalist exploitation and foreign economic domination. Perhaps most chilling was the systematic destruction of family relationships through policies that separated parents from children and spouses from each other, while encouraging denunciation of family members for insufficient revolution enthusiasm. Children were taught that loyalty to Angkar the organization took precedence over all other relationships, while parents were forced to watch their children transformed into instruments of state terror who might report their own families for political crimes. The economic policies pursued by the Khmer Rouge demonstrated the complete disconnect between revolutionary ideology and practical reality, as agricultural production collapsed despite massive investments of forced labor and the elimination of supposedly parasitic urban populations. The rejection of foreign trade, the abolition of money, and the destruction of professional and technical expertise created economic conditions that made starvation inevitable regardless of weather conditions or natural disasters. Pol Pot's paranoia reached new heights as the failures of Khmer Rouge policies became undeniable, leading to increasingly frantic searches for saboteurs and traitors who could be blamed for problems that were obviously the result of ideological fanaticism rather than enemy action. The purges that consumed the Khmer Rouge leadership during the late 1000s 970s eliminated many of the movement's founders, while creating an atmosphere of terror that extended even to Pol Pot's closest associates. The Vietnamese invasion of December 1978 brought the Khmer Rouge regime to an end after less than 4 years in power, but those years had been sufficient to reduce Cambodia's population by an estimated 1.52 million people, or only 25% of the total population. The speed and thoroughness of this demographic catastrophe was unprecedented in modern history, exceeding even the Nazi Holocaust in the percentage of the targeted population that was eliminated. The international response to the Cambodian genocide revealed the limitations of humanitarian intervention during the Cold War, as geopolitical considerations prevented effective action to stop mass atrocities. The fact that the Khmer Rouge continued to hold Cambodia's seat in the United Nations, even after their overthrow, demonstrated how completely strategic interests could override moral considerations in international relations. Pol Pot's escape to the Thai border and his continued leadership of Khmer Rouge forces during the 1980s showed how genocidal leaders could evade justice when protected by great power patrons who viewed them as useful allies against regional rivals. The Chinese and American support that allowed the Khmer Rouge to maintain their resistance against the Vietnamese-backed government in Phnom Penh represented one of the most morally bankrupt episodes in Cold War history. The trial of surviving Khmer Rouge leaders that finally began in 2006, nearly 3 decades after their crimes, demonstrated both the possibility of eventual justice and the limitations of international law when applied to mass atrocities. The death of most senior Khmer Rouge officials before they could be prosecuted meant that the full extent of their crimes would never be legally established, while the focus on individual responsibility obscured the institutional and ideological factors that had made the genocide possible. The legacy of Pol Pot's rule extended far beyond Cambodia's borders to influence radical movements throughout the developing world that were inspired by the Khmer Rouge model of revolutionary transformation. The idea that traditional societies could leapfrog stages of development by eliminating all vestiges of foreign influence appealed to nationalist movements that viewed modernization as a form of cultural imperialism, while the apparent success of Khmer Rouge military tactics inspired peasant insurgencies from Peru to the Philippines. Yet the ultimate lesson of the Cambodian genocide was not about the effectiveness of revolutionary strategy, but about the capacity of ideological fanaticism to override basic human decency when combined with absolute political power. The transformation of educated urban intellectuals like Pol Pot into architects of mass murder demonstrated that civilization was far more fragile than most people believed, and that the veneer of sophisticated political theory could disguise impulses that were fundamentally barbaric. The brother number one had succeeded in creating his vision of agrarian socialism, but it was a paradise that existed only in the minds of its creators, while reality consisted of mass graves, abandoned villages, and the traumatized survivors of one of history's most thorough attempts at social engineering. His revolution had indeed returned Cambodia to year zero, but it was the zero of death and devastation rather than the zero of new beginning that he had promised his followers. In the end, Pol Pot's greatest achievement was demonstrating how completely human society could be destroyed by leaders who confused their own ideological purity with objective truth and who viewed mass murder as acceptable means to utopian ends. The killing fields he created became monuments not to revolutionary achievement, but to the dangers of political messianism, unchecked by moral restraint or practical wisdom. Idi Amin, the butcher of Uganda. In the Pearl of Africa, where the waters of Lake Victoria reflect the eternal African sky and the mountains of the moon rise from mist-shrouded valleys that have witnessed the rise and fall of kingdoms since time immemorial, one man would transform paradise into a theatre of horror that defied rational explanation. Idi Amin Dada, the smiling giant who called himself the last king of Scotland and conqueror of the British Empire, embodied a unique form of tyranny that combined medieval brutality with modern media manipulation, creating a regime so bizarre and terrifying that it seemed like the product of fevered imagination rather than historical reality. Born around 1925 in the remote village of Koboko, in what was then the British Protectorate of Uganda, Amin emerged from the marginalized Kakwa ethnic group that straddled the borders of Uganda, Sudan, and Congo, making him an outsider in the complex ethnic hierarchies that characterized colonial East Africa. His early life was marked by the kind of poverty and displacement that characterized colonial subjects who lived on the periphery of imperial administration, far from the centers of power and privilege that educated elites like Milton Obote would later inherit from departing British administrators. The King's African Rifles that Amin joined as a young man provided him with his first taste of authority and his introduction to the systematic violence that would later characterize his rule. The colonial military forces that Britain maintained throughout East Africa were designed primarily to maintain internal security rather than to defend against external threats, and they attracted recruits from marginal ethnic groups who lacked the educational qualifications for civilian advancement but possessed the physical attributes necessary for military service. Amin's rapid rise through the ranks of the KAR reflected both his imposing physical presence. He stood nearly 6.5 feet tall and weighed over 250 pounds, and his willingness to employ violence against African populations that challenged British authority. His service during the Mau Mau emergency in Kenya during the 1950s provided him with experience in counterinsurgency warfare and systematic brutality against civilian populations, while his participation in operations against Turkana cattle raiders in northern Kenya demonstrated his capacity for the kind of punitive expeditions that characterized colonial military practice. The independence that came to Uganda in 1962 found Amin positioned as one of the few African officers in what became the Uganda Army, where his lack of formal education was offset by his reputation for personal loyalty to Prime Minister Milton Obote and his effectiveness in dealing with military problems through direct action rather than political maneuvering. His role in the 1966 attack on the Kabaka's palace that ended the traditional monarchy of Buganda revealed both his willingness to destroy ancient institutions and his utility as an instrument of Obote's increasingly authoritarian rule. But the relationship between Obote and Amin that had begun as patron and client gradually transformed into mutual suspicion and barely concealed hostility as Uganda's first prime minister recognized that his former protégé had developed ambitions that extended far beyond military command. Amin's involvement in gold and ivory smuggling operations that enriched army officers while undermining government revenues, combined with his cultivation of relationships with Israeli military advisors that bypassed civilian oversight, convinced Obote that his army commander was becoming a threat to his own position. The military coup that brought Amin to power in January 1971 was initially welcomed by many Ugandans who had grown weary of Obote's increasingly repressive rule and his movement toward one-party state socialism that seemed to benefit only his own ethnic group and political allies. Amin's promises to restore democracy, end tribal favoritism, and return Uganda to civilian rule within a reasonable time frame appeared to offer hope for a new beginning that would heal the divisions that had plagued the country since independence. The early months of Amin's rule seemed to justify the optimism of his supporters as he released political prisoners, promised new elections, and presented himself as a simple soldier who wanted only to restore order before returning to barracks. His folksy manner and apparent lack of political sophistication led many observers, both Ugandan and foreign, to underestimate his capacity for systematic brutality and his determination to transform Uganda into his personal fiefdom regardless of constitutional niceties or international opinion. But the facade of military restraint quickly dissolved as Amin began eliminating potential threats to his rule through methods that revealed both his paranoid suspicions and his casual attitude toward human life. The massacre of soldiers from Obote's ethnic group and region provided early evidence of Amin's willingness to employ genocidal methods against populations he deemed unreliable, while the systematic torture and execution of educated Ugandans who might provide alternative leadership demonstrated his understanding that terror was more effective than persuasion in maintaining political control. The expulsion of Uganda's Asian population in 1972 revealed the economic dimension of Amin's brutality as the systematic looting of successful businesses and professional practices provided both immediate wealth for distribution to his supporters and long-term economic control through the elimination of a potentially powerful class that might challenge his authority. The 90-day deadline that Amin imposed for Asian departure was designed to prevent the orderly transfer of assets while maximizing the chaos that would allow regime supporters to seize valuable property. The international response to the Asian expulsion, which displaced approximately 80,000 people who held British passports, demonstrated both the limitations of humanitarian intervention and the extent to which Cold War considerations influenced Western responses to human rights abuses. While Britain accepted most of the expelled Asians as refugees, the broader international community took little action to challenge Amin's policies or impose meaningful sanctions that might have restrained his increasingly erratic behavior. The bizarre public persona that Amin cultivated during the mid-1970s served multiple purposes. It diverted attention from the systematic brutality of his rule while positioning him as an authentic African leader who refused to be intimidated by Western criticism or conventional diplomatic protocol. His adoption of increasingly grandiose titles including His Excellency President for Life, Field Marshal Al-Haji Dr. Idi Amin Dada, VC, DSO, MC, Lord of all the beasts of the earth and fishes of the seas, and conqueror of the British Empire in Africa in general and Uganda in particular, reflected both his megalomania and his shrewd understanding of how media attention could be manipulated to create international celebrity that provided protection against serious intervention. The claims about cannibalism that surrounded Amin throughout his rule, including his alleged boast that human flesh was too salty for his taste, were never definitively proven but reflected the atmosphere of horror that his regime created through systematic dehumanization of his victims and public spectacles of violence that seemed designed to break the psychological resistance of potential opponents. Whether literally true or not, these stories served Amin's purposes by creating an image of unpredictable savagery that made resistance seem futile. The state-sponsored terrorism that characterized daily life in Amin's Uganda was implemented through a complex network of security organizations that included the military police, the public safety unit, and various informal groups of enforcers who operated with complete impunity while competing for the dictator's favor through displays of enthusiastic brutality. The arbitrary nature of arrests and disappearances created an atmosphere where survival depended on avoiding any behavior that might be interpreted as political opposition, while the public display of mutilated corpses served as constant reminders of the consequences of challenging regime authority. The economic collapse that accompanied Amin's political repression was not merely an unfortunate side effect of poor policies, but a deliberate strategy for maintaining control through the systematic impoverishment of populations that might otherwise have resources to organize resistance. The destruction of productive capacity through the expulsion of Asian entrepreneurs and the elimination of educated Ugandans created conditions of scarcity that made basic survival dependent on regime favor, while hyperinflation and currency manipulation enriched Amin's inner circle at the expense of ordinary citizens. Perhaps most disturbing was the systematic recruitment of children as instruments of state terror, as Amin's security forces deliberately sought out young people who could be more easily indoctrinated and who lacked the moral development that might restrain them from committing atrocities against their own communities. The use of child soldiers as enforcers of regime policies created a generation of traumatized individuals whose capacity for normal social relationships had been permanently damaged by their participation in systematic violence. The targeting of specific ethnic groups for elimination revealed the genocidal dimension of Amin's rule, as communities that he perceived as threats to his authority faced systematic persecution that included mass killings, forced displacement, and cultural destruction. The near extinction of the Akoli and Lango peoples of northern Uganda was achieved through military operations that combined conventional warfare with deliberate targeting of civilians, while the destruction of traditional leadership structures eliminated potential sources of organized resistance. The international isolation that gradually enveloped Amin's regime during the late 1000s 970s reflected growing recognition that his government had moved beyond conventional authoritarianism into forms of systematic brutality that threatened regional stability and international norms. The break with Israel following the Entebbe hostage crisis, the deteriorating relationships with Kenya and Tanzania over border disputes and refugee flows, and the increasing reluctance of Western governments to maintain normal diplomatic relations all contributed to Uganda's transformation into a pariah state. The Entebbe hostage crisis of 1976 provided Amin with his greatest moment of international attention, while simultaneously revealing the extent of his collaboration with international terrorism and his willingness to risk confrontation with major powers for the sake of publicity and ideological posturing. His decision to cooperate with the Palestinian hijackers while selectively releasing non-Jewish hostages demonstrated both his anti-Semitism and his calculation that dramatic gestures could compensate for Uganda's international isolation. The war with Tanzania that began in 1978 represented both the inevitable consequence of Amin's aggressive policies and the beginning of his downfall, as his decision to invade Tanzanian territory provided Julius Nyerere with the justification for military intervention that had been building for years. The Uganda army that Amin had used to terrorize his own population proved incapable of sustained military operations against a competent external enemy, while the lack of popular support for his regime meant that advancing Tanzanian forces were often welcomed as liberators rather than resisted as invaders. The discovery of mass graves and torture chambers as Tanzanian forces advanced through Uganda provided international observers with physical evidence of atrocities that had previously been dismissed as exaggerated propaganda or unverifiable rumors. The scale of systematic killing that was revealed with conservative estimates, suggesting that 500 Ugandans had died during Amin's 8-year rule, placed his regime among the most murderous in African history, while demonstrating how completely a single individual could destroy the social fabric of an entire nation. Amin's flight to Libya and eventual exile in Saudi Arabia provided a comfortable ending that contrasted starkly with the suffering he had inflicted on millions of Ugandans, while his ability to avoid prosecution for crimes against humanity demonstrated the limitations of international justice when applied to African conflicts during the Cold War era. His death in 2003 in a Saudi hospital ended the life of one of history's most destructive tyrants, but it also denied justice to his victims and their families who had waited decades for accountability. The legacy of Amin's rule extended far beyond Uganda's borders to influence international understanding of post-colonial African politics and the capacity of individual leaders to destroy functioning societies through systematic violence and economic mismanagement. His regime became a case study in how quickly modern states could collapse when subjected to policies that prioritized personal power over institutional development, while his international celebrity demonstrated how media attention could be manipulated to create sympathy for obviously criminal leaders. The Uganda that emerged from Amin's rule was a traumatized society that had lost not just hundreds of thousands of citizens, but also the institutional knowledge and social trust necessary for effective governance. The restoration of democracy and economic development under subsequent leaders like Yoweri Museveni was complicated by the need to rebuild everything from basic infrastructure to professional education systems that Amin had systematically destroyed during his years in power. Yet perhaps the most lasting impact of Amin's rule was the demonstration that traditional African political systems and colonial institutional legacies provided insufficient protection against determined tyrants who were willing to employ unlimited violence in pursuit of personal power. His success in eliminating all effective opposition while maintaining international recognition for nearly a decade revealed the weakness of both domestic civil society and international oversight mechanisms when confronted with leaders who rejected all conventional restraints on state behavior. The butcher of Uganda had proven that individual pathology could indeed reshape entire nations when combined with modern military technology and systematic exploitation of ethnic divisions. His reign of terror served as a warning about the fragility of civilized society and the speed with which functioning states could be transformed into killing fields when placed under the control of leaders who viewed human life as expendable in the pursuit of personal aggrandizement. In the end, Amin's greatest achievement was negative. He had shown how completely a single individual could destroy the work of generations, while convincing much of the world that his actions were merely the unfortunate excesses of African politics rather than crimes against humanity that demanded international intervention. His comfortable exile and natural death represented a failure of justice that would influence African attitudes toward international law and humanitarian intervention for decades to come. The smiling giant had left behind a legacy written in mass graves and traumatized memories, a reminder that evil could indeed wear a human face, and that the greatest monsters were often those who appeared most human to the outside world. His name became synonymous with the dangers of unchecked power in post-colonial Africa, serving as a cautionary tale about what could happen when traditional restraints on authority were destroyed without being replaced by effective institutional alternatives.